Hi guys, welcome to HistSleep. In the long, quiet stretch of the Victorian morning, when the sun had barely begun to press its pale light against the heavy curtains, a woman's world already carried an unspoken rule. Silence was the first expectation placed upon her. It was not written in any book, nor announced in any household. It simply existed, like the cool air resting on the windowsill or the slow ticking of the hallway clock. It was so deeply woven into daily life that most women learned it before they could remember the learning. Silence, in those days, was considered a refined companion. It shaped behavior, trained thoughts, and restrained the heart's impulses. The quieter a woman was, the more respectable she appeared to society. And in a world where reputation was often valued more than comfort, silence became a duty rather than a choice. It hovered around young girls at their nursery tables, followed them into drawing rooms, and settled softly over every conversation they were permitted to have. A Victorian woman began her day gently, cautiously, and with the understanding that sound was not hers to command freely. Even the rustle of skirts had rules. When she rose from bed, she moved slowly, so the mattress wouldn't creak. When she crossed a corridor, she stepped lightly to avoid disturbing the servants, who were ironically allowed to make more noise than she was. The simple act of opening a door became a lesson in restraint. Turn the knob carefully, push slowly, never allow the hinges to echo through the house. It was not unusual for mothers to correct their daughters in the softest tones imaginable. A whispered instruction during breakfast, a quiet murmur while preparing to greet guests. Everything was delivered with calm precision, as if sound itself was a fragile substance that might shatter if mishandled. Many young girls grew so accustomed to being told, "Speak softly, mind your voice," and "a lady does not shout," that eventually these words no longer felt like rules. They felt like part of their identity, something as natural as breathing, only softer. In many homes, silence was intertwined with respect. A woman who spoke less was believed to think more, though no one truly asked what she was thinking. A wife who kept her voice low was considered well-mannered, even if her quietness came from fear or exhaustion. And a daughter who sat quietly while adults conversed was praised as graceful, though her stillness might have masked a restless curiosity. Without intending to, society became a mirror reflecting back one consistent message: a quiet woman was a good woman. The drawing room, a favorite space for late morning visits, was perhaps the greatest stage for this unspoken rule. Women gathered there surrounded by calm wallpaper colors, low sunlight, and the gentle perfume of pressed linen. Yet even in these moments of company, there was a kind of measured stillness. Conversations were soft and controlled. Laughter was not forbidden, but it had to be delicate, never too loud, never too unrestrained. Vocal expression was carefully trimmed like the hedges in the garden outside. But silence extended far beyond vocal volume. It reached into topics that women simply weren't allowed to discuss freely: politics, strong opinions, frustrations, ambitions. These belonged to the louder spaces of men. A woman could speak about weather, household matters, polite compliments, or the health of relatives. It was not that women lacked stronger thoughts. They simply lived in a period when society believed such thoughts were better left unspoken. Silence became a filter that removed the edges from their words, smoothing their speech until only gentleness remained. The stillness followed women outdoors as well. Victorian streets were full of activity, horses clattering, wheels turning, vendors calling. But women were expected to move through that noise like slipping through a dream. Their footsteps were rehearsed in quietness. Their hands rested calmly in gloves. Their expressions were soft enough that no passerby could guess their emotions. Even the slightest burst of sound, a laugh too bright, a surprised gasp, could earn a disapproving glance. And in a world structured around reputation, even a glance carried weight. Inside the household, silence shaped relationships in more personal ways. Husbands often returned home to peaceful environments, where wives were expected to soothe worries rather than express their own. Mothers taught daughters to appear serene even when inconvenienced. Sisters learned to keep their disagreements behind closed doors. In many families, strong emotions, whether anger, joy, or disappointment, were handled with quiet restraint. Voices rarely rose above a gentle hum, and those who spoke too boldly were quickly reminded that passion, in a woman, was considered improper. Even reading was often a silent experience full of unspoken boundaries. A woman could read novels, poetry, or religious texts, but she was encouraged to absorb them quietly. If a passage moved her deeply, she was expected to close the book with composure, not express her feelings aloud. Books offered a world of ideas, but the outer world reminded her that true expression had limits. She could think richly, but she must live softly. Letters, too, reflected this unwritten rule. A Victorian woman's handwriting was often neat, round, and practiced, but the content of her letters was even more restrained. She learned early on that expressing too much emotion, even in writing, could be viewed as a lack of self-control. So she wrote carefully, choosing calm words even when her heart felt anything but calm. Entire generations communicated through ink that hid more than it revealed. The silence of their lives seeped into the spaces between sentences, forming a kind of quiet language only they understood. But silence was not always forced. At times it was embraced. The slow rhythm of daily life allowed women to find pockets of gentle reflection, quiet sewing sessions by the window, peaceful moments tending to small gardens, long hours spent preparing rooms or folding linens. These activities created a calm environment where silence was not oppressive but comforting. Stillness became a familiar companion, a soothing presence in a world that moved carefully rather than hurriedly. But beneath that tranquility was a truth many women understood but seldom voiced. Silence held power, yet it also imposed limits. It protected reputations, but obscured feelings. It smoothed over conflicts, but prevented conversations. It created peaceful households, but silenced entire identities. In the late afternoons, when the sun softened and the corridors grew dim, many women felt the weight of this quietness most strongly. They would sit by the fireplace or at their writing desks and feel the gentle pressure of unspoken thoughts. They had opinions, dreams, frustrations, many of which needed sound to take shape. But making sound was not part of the expectation placed upon them, so they lived in the space between inner noise and outer quiet, carrying voices that rarely reached the world beyond their own rooms. Silence shaped friendships as well. Women often bonded through shared stillness, gentle conversations, thoughtful glances, the simple comfort of being near someone who understood the rules without needing explanations. Their closeness often grew in the moments when they said the least. But even within these friendships, certain topics were handled with care, wrapped in polite phrasing and softened by cultural expectations. Secrets were whispered, but dreams were seldom declared. The rule of silence also helped maintain the delicate social order the Victorian world so highly valued. A woman who spoke loudly or challenged norms risked being labeled as improper, unfeminine, or rebellious. These labels could follow her through society, affecting marriage prospects, friendships, and opportunities. As a result, most women learned early to guard not only their voices, but their opinions. Silence became a survival tool in a world that offered limited space for deviation. At evening gatherings, where families entertained guests with calm music and gentle conversation, silence acted as an invisible guide. Women played the piano softly, their fingers gliding across keys without force. They listened more than they spoke. They smiled politely even when the discussions around them felt distant or dull. They held themselves with the kind of poise that comes from constant practice. The quietness that accompanied these events was not accidental, but carefully maintained, a reflection of society's collective preference for refinement over expression. Even nighttime carried its own expectations. Before bed, women often walked through dim halls in near complete silence, careful not to disturb anyone. Conversations were brief and muted. Doors were closed softly. Candles were extinguished with gentle care. The day began in quietness and ended the same way, creating a cycle of stillness that shaped every moment in between. Across generations, this rule of silence passed from mother to daughter like a family heirloom. Some accepted it without question, others resisted quietly in their hearts, but all understood its influence. It shaped how they moved.
The art of walking without being seen. In the quiet world of Victorian womanhood, where silence shaped every breath and stillness framed every gesture, the simple act of walking carried an entirely different meaning. To move through space was not merely to travel from one room to another, it was to demonstrate discipline, restraint, and a kind of invisible elegance that society admired far more than comfort. Walking, for Victorian women, became a practiced performance, an unspoken lesson repeated thousands of times, until the body learned to obey even when the mind wandered. It was an art, subtle and subdued, shaped by expectations that were always present, like a soft shadow that followed every step. From the earliest years of girlhood, the rules of movement were taught almost unintentionally. A mother might say, "Don't hurry, dear," as a child rushed across a hallway. A governess might murmur, "Straighten your back," when she noticed a young girl leaning forward. These simple corrections accumulated slowly, layering themselves into a lifelong habit. A Victorian girl did not wake one morning knowing how to walk without being noticed. She learned it through countless tiny instructions, each one reinforcing the idea that a woman's movement should never draw attention. Walking, for these women, was less about motion and more about presence, or rather, the soft reduction of it. A lady was expected to glide, not stride. She was to appear gentle, controlled, and quietly composed, moving through rooms with the kind of lightness that made observers forget she was there at all. The goal was not to disappear exactly, but to exist with so little disturbance that her presence became as natural as the quiet rustle of drapes in a calm afternoon breeze. Inside the house, this art was most evident. Victorian homes with their polished floors, narrow staircases, and delicate decorations were not designed for loud footsteps. Every surface seemed ready to echo, amplifying even the smallest sound. Women learned to avoid this by placing their feet softly, rolling each step from heel to toe in a deliberate, measured rhythm. The motion resembled a quiet dance, one performed daily without audience or applause. Servants, who often moved briskly and spoke more freely, provided a contrasting example. Their hurried footsteps echoed through corridors, bringing life to the house. But for the lady of the home, such noise was unthinkable. Her steps had to be calm, gentle, almost floating, even when she walked with purpose, perhaps to answer a call from another room or to meet a guest at the front door. Her pace remained controlled. The essence of refinement lay in appearing unhurried, unaffected by urgency. A lady did not rush, she simply arrived. Walking outdoors, however, required an entirely different kind of awareness. The Victorian street was full of distractions, horse-drawn carriages clattering on cobblestones, vendors calling out their wares, neighbors chatting loudly beneath open windows. In this environment, a woman had to maintain the same disciplined grace expected indoors, despite the noise around her. She walked carefully, keeping her gaze modestly lowered, her posture straight, her movements free of any unnecessary motion. Her steps were measured, not just to avoid tripping on uneven stones or long skirts, but to maintain the quiet dignity her upbringing demanded. Even the clothing dictated how she walked. A Victorian woman's dress with its multiple layers, long hems, and structured bodice required calculated steps. She could not stride too widely without risking a stumble. She could not move too quickly without causing her skirts to sway too boldly. Corsets restricted her breathing, forcing her to take smaller steps and avoid abrupt movements. Shoes were often narrow and delicately made, offering little support on rough surfaces. All these elements combined to create a style of walking that was slow, careful, and deeply deliberate. This physical restraint blended with social expectations. A woman in public was always being watched, whether directly or through the subtle glances of passers-by. Society judged her by how she carried herself, her modesty, her discipline, her refinement. A step that was too heavy, too fast, or too broad could be seen as improper. Even something as small as the sound of her heel clicking too sharply on a stone path could raise silent questions about her upbringing. And so she walked with quiet awareness, each movement shaped by a mix of clothing, culture, and careful observation. Young women preparing for social events were often given special walking lessons, though they were rarely framed as such. A mother might say, "Walk as though the air is carrying you," or "Move as if you are listening for something delicate." These were poetic instructions, but they served a practical purpose, encouraging a sense of floating ease rather than the natural confident strides a woman might take if left untrained. Girls practiced walking across parlors or along garden paths until they learned the rhythm expected of them. Their movements became smoother, quieter, more controlled. Over time, they learned to approach a group without startling anyone with sudden motion, to sit without shifting a chair too loudly, to cross a room with such gentle precision that even the family dog barely lifted its head. This cultivated invisibility extended into social settings. At gatherings or teas, women were expected to move with effortless grace. When approaching a table, they did so without brushing against furniture. When sitting, they lowered themselves with calm precision. When rising, they smoothed their skirts quietly and stepped away without disrupting conversations. The elegance of their movement was part of their social value. In a world that praised restraint, their controlled motions communicated politeness, gentility, and self-discipline. Even the simplest actions reflected these expectations. Reaching for a teacup required a soft motion. Crossing a room to greet a guest demanded gentle steps. Adjusting a shawl called for quiet fingers. Everything was part of the same visual language, one that prioritized stillness over spontaneity, gentleness over confidence, subtlety over expressiveness. Yet beneath this calm exterior, women often lived with a deep awareness of the rules guiding their movements. Many knew, silently and without complaint, that their steps were shaped not by choice, but by perception. They walked lightly because society preferred them quiet. They moved slowly because society valued their gentleness more than their ambition. They practiced invisibility because being noticed could bring judgment, misunderstanding, or unwanted attention. Even walking to avoid being seen took on a literal meaning. Women often positioned themselves strategically, choosing paths along the edges of rooms or hallways to avoid interrupting others. In gardens or parks, they took narrow walkways where branches and hedges created natural boundaries. At social events, a woman might wait for others to move first, stepping only when she knew she would not draw the eye. Her movement was a careful negotiation between the desire to exist freely and the expectation to remain understated. Yet this restraint had a strangely serene quality. When practiced day after day, it created a rhythm, a soft, steady pattern that fits seamlessly into the calmness of Victorian domestic life. Women could glide from room to room with a sense of inner stillness, their steps synchronized with the gentle hum of household life. Walking became a moment of reflection as much as motion. Each slow step allowed space for thought, observation, and calm absorption of the world around them. But this serenity often masked an inner truth that women longed at times to move more freely. They wished to lift their skirts and run across a meadow without worrying about propriety. They wanted to walk briskly down a street without worrying who might be watching. They imagined the freedom of climbing hills, exploring cities, or simply stretching their legs without restraint. But this freedom was considered improper, too bold for the feminine ideal constructed around them. The art of walking quietly was not merely a habit, it was a boundary that defined their daily lives. Inside the home, this restraint influenced how women interacted with family members. A mother approached her children softly, stepping lightly to maintain the household's calm atmosphere. A wife walked slowly to avoid disturbing her husband's work or rest. An elder daughter moved through the house in near silent patterns, helping maintain the quiet environment expected of respectable homes. Even disagreements were softened by physical stillness. Raised voices were discouraged, and quick emotional movements were viewed as undignified. The act of walking quietly became a symbol of emotional control. The staircase, too, played a symbolic role. Victorian women were
the gentle balance of perfect posture. In the quiet discipline of Victorian womanhood, where silence softened every room and walking became a controlled art form, posture rose to become yet another silent rule, an expected shape of the body that reflected the shape of one's character. A woman's posture was not simply how she stood, it was, in the eyes of society, a reflection of her upbringing, her manners, her inner restraint, and her respectability. Perfect posture was both a symbol and a requirement, woven tightly into daily life like the stitching of her corset. It was a quiet balance she carried everywhere, from the breakfast table to the street outside and even into the private corners of her own bedroom. Most Victorian women learned the importance of posture long before they understood why it mattered. As children, their earliest lessons rarely came through books, but through subtle gestures of correction. A mother's gentle touch between the shoulder blades, a governess's light tap under the chin, a whispered reminder during sewing lessons, "Straighten yourself, dear. A lady must always sit tall." These small cues accumulated like layers of fabric, shaping young girls into the poised figures society expected them to become. Posture was a performance of stillness. A woman's back must remain straight, her neck elongated, her shoulders relaxed yet never slouched. Her chin hovered at a modest angle, not too high lest she appear proud, and not too low lest she seem timid. The ideal was a calm, balanced middle ground, as if she carried an invisible book atop her head and dared not let it fall. The effect created a kind of soft elegance, a silhouette of grace that seemed effortless to the casual observer, though it was anything but effortless for the women maintaining it. Inside the home, posture shaped nearly everything. Morning tea, needlework, reading lessons, piano practice, each activity required a steady, upright spine. Even moments of rest were performed with restraint, for leaning back too comfortably might wrinkle a carefully pressed skirt or appear unladylike. Sofas were often firm, chairs upright, and cushions modest so that nothing encouraged a relaxed slouch. A Victorian woman rarely melted into furniture the way modern people do. Instead, she perched gently, as if the chair were a temporary pedestal rather than a place meant for comfort. Meals offered another stage for the display of posture. At the dining table, a woman had to maintain a balance between stillness and small, controlled movement. Her elbows stayed neatly tucked, her shoulders lowered, her back straight. Even the simple act of reaching for a dish had expectations, her arm extended smoothly, her hand steady, her torso unmoving. Everything she did was meant to preserve the illusion of calm refinement. Posture became the physical expression of her manners, and the Victorian dining room became a quiet arena where those manners were constantly examined. Clothing, as always, played a complicated role. Corsets, the rigid companions of Victorian life, shaped posture in both intentional and unintentional ways. Designed to narrow the waist, support the bust, and create an hourglass silhouette, corsets forced women into a posture that society deemed most elegant, upright, still, and carefully controlled. Even if a woman wanted to slouch or relax her back, the stiff bones of her corset made such movement nearly impossible. In this way, fashion reinforced the very expectations culture had created. It became both a guide and a reminder: straighten, hold, balance, breathe shallowly, move gently. Some women found comfort in this structure. The familiar embrace of the corset created a sense of order, like a soft boundary that supported their daily rhythm. Others, however, felt its pressure more sharply. The tightness around the ribs restricted deep breaths, turning posture into a silent endurance. Yet complaints were rare. Victorian women were taught to carry discomfort with grace, to mask strain with serenity. Posture, like silence, was another form of self-discipline. Walking with perfect posture was its own delicate challenge. The gentle balance of the spine had to remain intact as women navigated long skirts, uneven pathways, and restrictive shoes. Their movements, guided by practice, became slow and almost gliding. Each step required awareness of their center of gravity, of the way their shoulders aligned, of the gentle sway their skirts created. A slight misstep could disrupt the entire silhouette, causing a woman to appear unsteady or improper. And so, posture became a constant companion, something she adjusted with every breath and every movement. Social gatherings placed this expectation under a magnifying glass. In parlors and drawing rooms, where conversations flowed softly and eyes observed quietly, posture was as important as speech. A slouched back or tilted head could suggest boredom or impoliteness. A perfectly balanced posture, however, showed attentiveness and gentle composure. Women were often reminded, sometimes subtly and sometimes directly, to maintain their form throughout long visits. Even during moments of laughter, they were expected to keep their bodies controlled, their shoulders relaxed, their expressions calm. Music lessons further nurtured this posture. Girls learning piano were taught to sit forward, shoulders low, back straight, wrists level. The discipline of the instrument mirrored the discipline of daily life. Playing a single song demanded not only musical skill, but bodily restraint. The fingers moved freely, but the rest of the body remained elegantly still. These lessons extended far beyond the piano bench, teaching young women how to hold their composure in any situation. Posture also played a silent role in courtship. Victorian romance, shaped by distance and restraint, relied heavily on controlled appearances. A woman's stillness conveyed modesty. Her poised sitting suggested diligence and respectability. Her upright walk signaled discipline and upbringing. Young men noticed these details. Society taught them to. And because marriage often depended on impressions formed during brief encounters, a woman's posture became a powerful, if silent, introduction. Even solitude required posture. When a woman sat alone in her bedroom or private sitting room, she often maintained the same upright form expected of her in public. Habit made this natural, but society reinforced it. Mothers told daughters that a lady's posture reflects her inner character even when no one is watching. And so, long after public eyes had turned away, women still held themselves carefully, sewing with straight backs, reading with lifted chins, daydreaming in composed silhouettes. The emphasis on posture was not without emotional impact. Many women internalized the belief that physical discipline equaled moral discipline. A crooked back suggested laziness, lifted shoulders hinted at tension or anxiety, a tilted head might appear careless. These judgments, though silent, weighed heavily. Girls grew into young women who measured themselves not only by their actions, but by the quiet shape of their bodies. They learned to read the world's expectations in the set of their own spine. Yet, amid the pressure, posture also offered a strange sense of empowerment. Maintaining perfect posture gave women a sense of inner strength. Standing tall, quite literally, created a feeling of poise that went beyond appearance. It offered a private, quiet dignity, something under their control even when other aspects of life were not. Posture became a way for women to claim a small part of themselves. In a world that demanded silence and invisibility, the controlled lift of a neck or the balanced stillness of a back offered a subtle form of individuality. Some women found moments of relief when posture was less observed, early mornings before the household stirred, afternoons spent alone in the garden, evenings when corsets loosened and daily expectations faded. During such moments, they allowed themselves small liberties, a gentle lean against a window frame, a soft curve of the spine while watching the sunset, a rare moment of letting their shoulders drop completely. These quiet pauses reminded them of their own humanity beneath the layers of training, clothing, and expectation. But these moments were temporary. As soon as another person entered the room, posture reassembled like a well-practiced mask. The straight back returned, the chin lifted slightly, the shoulders softened outward. Victorian posture was not just a physical state, it was a performance that never truly ended. Education reinforced this performance. In finishing schools, girls practiced walking with books balanced on their heads, learning to move without disturbing the delicate
Smiles that hid every emotion. In the quiet, carefully arranged world of Victorian womanhood, a smile was never simply a smile. It was a curtain, light, delicate, and almost transparent, drawn gently across a woman's true feelings. Anyone who looked closely enough might have sensed something stirring beneath it, something human and unpolished. But polite society was trained not to look too closely. A woman's smile existed to reassure others that everything was calm, respectable, and entirely under control, even when her inner world swayed like a lantern in a winter storm. From the earliest years of childhood, girls learned that their expressions belonged not to themselves, but to the expectations of the world around them. Their mothers taught them without words, through example, through quiet gestures, through the soft tilt of the mouth that appeared whenever a neighbor entered the room or a relative offered an unwelcome opinion. It was a smile that communicated obedience, patience, and unspoken agreement. A smile that promised never to disturb the gentle order of the household. The training began long before a girl understood why she needed it. She was told to smile when guests arrived, to smile when being introduced, to smile when corrected, and to smile even when she felt the sting of embarrassment. These early lessons shaped her understanding of emotion, that feelings were not meant for public view, and that happiness was not a requirement for wearing its expression. The real goal was composure, a quiet, graceful steadiness that reassured the world she was exactly as she appeared. Inside parlors where the air felt thick with embroidered cushions, polished furniture, and the faint scent of lavender, Victorian women moved like soft shadows. Their conversations were gentle, measured, and filled with politeness. Yet beneath every sentence lingered the quiet pressure to smile at the appropriate moments, to appear pleased when offered a chair, grateful when a gentleman spoke, or amused when someone made a mild joke that barely earned genuine laughter. This constant emotional choreography became second nature, an unspoken rule of the era. Their smiles were not wide. Victorian etiquette discouraged anything too expressive. Laughing openly was considered improper for a lady. Showing teeth was considered coarse. Instead, women held a subtle, fragile curve of the lips that communicated just enough warmth to seem pleasant, but not enough boldness to imply assertiveness. It was a balance, delicate, intentional, and endlessly exhausting. A woman's smile was especially important in uncomfortable moments. If someone insulted her, she smiled softly. If she received unwanted attention, she smiled politely. If she was asked a question she wished not to answer, she smiled and gave a gentle, evasive reply. Her smile became her armor, thin, elegant, and quietly suffocating. Even in the presence of suitors, the smile served as a tool of restraint. It kept emotions hidden, prevented misunderstandings, and softened the edges of awkward encounters. A young woman might receive a compliment she disliked, an offer she did not want, or a question she feared. Still, she lifted her chin slightly, curved her lips, and allowed the expression to do the work her voice was not permitted to do. A refusal delivered without a smile was considered rude. A hesitation without one was seen as defiant. Many women became so skilled at this quiet performance that their inner thoughts rarely surfaced, even among family. They learned to walk through life with two layers, the outer one calm and pleasant, the inner one filled with hopes, fears, irritations, and the small rebellions of the mind that Victorian society preferred to ignore. They mastered the art of smiling while listening to conversations that bored them, while accepting limitations they wished to challenge, while witnessing judgments they secretly disagreed with. Yet the most practiced smiles were reserved for moments of personal struggle. There were women who smiled through heartbreak, through illness, through the weight of exhaustion. There were women who smiled as their husbands spoke over them, as their dreams were politely dismissed, as their opinions were gently pushed aside. There were women who smiled while grieving because sorrow was expected to be quiet, composed, and hidden behind a pleasant expression. Inside the home, these smiles were equally essential. When hosting guests, a woman greeted each person with a calm, warm expression that suggested nothing in her life could possibly be troubled. She served tea with the same gentle smile, even if the water boiled over or the children misbehaved moments earlier. She maintained it through long afternoons of conversation, through evenings filled with tedious expectations, and through nights when she felt too tired to speak. Her smile was the thread that held her role together, the thing that kept the household's social image smooth and untarnished. But behind closed doors, when the curtains were drawn and the lamps dimmed, the mask often slipped. A woman might sit at her vanity, staring into the polished glass, her features softening into something truer, something unfiltered. Her eyes might reveal a heaviness hidden beneath the day's gentle expressions. The corners of her mouth might fall into the shape nature intended, not the shape society required. Only in these private moments did her face belong entirely to her. Some women wrote about these hidden truths in letters they never sent or diaries they kept tucked beneath their pillows. Their words revealed how tiring it was to smile through every moment, how strange it felt to bury genuine emotions beneath layers of politeness. They wrote of longing, for honesty, for the ability to express frustration, for the simple freedom to let their faces reflect what their hearts felt. Others found small, quiet ways to rebel,
a sharper glance than expected, a firmer tone, a rare refusal to smile when addressed in a condescending manner. These small acts were not loud, but they were powerful. They reminded women that beneath every polite expression lived a real person, a person with thoughts, desires, and strength. Even so, the smile remained a constant companion. It appeared in family portraits, in social gatherings, in quiet afternoons spent sewing by the window. It was a polite mask, a universal language, a quiet symbol of a society that valued appearance over emotion. And though each woman's smile looked gentle and effortless, it carried stories of restraint, endurance, and the unspoken complexities of a life lived under constant expectations. The story does not end here. This chapter is only one layer of the larger portrait, the portrait of Victorian womanhood built piece by piece across 20 silent, forgotten rules. The next chapter waits patiently, just beyond the curve of that quiet smile.
Language of lowered eyes, where one woman's gaze held a meaning all its own. In the Victorian world, where every gesture carried a quiet meaning, a woman's eyes often spoke the loudest, by staying lowered. This simple act, gentle and nearly invisible, became one of the era's most powerful forms of communication. It was a language built not from words or expressions, but from silence, stillness, and the careful direction of a woman's gaze. To lower one's eyes was to show modesty, humility, and respect. It was also to surrender to the structure society expected her to uphold. From early girlhood, Victorian daughters learned when to look down. They practiced it the way others practiced handwriting or piano, slowly, patiently, until it became second nature. Their mothers demonstrated the proper angle, not too low to appear fearful, not too quick to seem evasive, but just enough to show calm restraint. A lowered gaze suggested softness, obedience, and a quiet willingness to fade into the background when needed. It was the opposite of confidence, yet it was praised as a sign of good character. During conversations, especially with men, a young woman rarely held direct eye contact. To look into someone's eyes too boldly suggested assertiveness or flirtation, traits that polite society found unsettling in a lady. Instead, she allowed her gaze to hover near the floor, lifting it only briefly before returning it gently downward. This subtle choreography protected her reputation. A woman who looked up too often risked appearing forward. A woman who looked down too rarely risked appearing rebellious. In drawing rooms, this silent language shaped every interaction. When a guest entered, women stood with their hands folded and eyes lowered, acknowledging his presence without seeming eager for attention. When a conversation grew uncomfortable, lowered eyes softened the tension. When a compliment came that she did not wish to receive, a downward glance allowed her to politely retreat without speaking a single word. And when someone spoke unkindly, her lowered eyes showed patience, a calm refusal to engage. But this quiet language was not just for social moments. It was woven into daily life. A woman lowered her eyes when passing strangers on the street. She lowered them when riding in carriages, so as not to appear curious about the world outside. She lowered them during meals, when elders or superiors spoke. She lowered them even while walking through her own home, especially when guests were present. Through all of this, the gesture whispered the same message. I am gentle. I am respectful. I am under control. Those who watched Victorian women from the outside often assumed that lowered eyes meant shyness or fragility. But inside the minds of those women, the truth was more complex. Some lowered their eyes out of habit, others out of genuine modesty, and some because life gave them little choice. Many learned to use this gesture strategically, allowing their quietness to shield their thoughts. Behind a downward gaze, a woman could think freely,
unnoticed, her real opinions protected by the curtain of her own eyelashes. There were moments when this gesture became a kind of refuge. A woman who felt overwhelmed or uncomfortable could retreat behind her lowered eyes, hiding her reaction beneath the soft shadow of her lashes. No one could easily read her expression. No one could see the flicker of irritation or the spark of amusement. A simple downward glance smoothed over every emotion, turning her face into a calm, perfect surface. Yet this language also carried weight. It reminded women of the worlds they could not fully enter. Boldness was not theirs to claim openly. Curiosity was something they experienced privately. Their eyes were expected to move gently, slowly, and with constant awareness of how they might be interpreted. Even as their hearts longed to look up, to observe, to question, to engage, they learned to let their eyelids guide them back into quietness. For some women, this expectation became a daily struggle. They admired the world around them, yet felt compelled to limit their gaze. They wanted to look directly at people, to show confidence, to express interest, but they knew such actions might invite judgment. A held gaze from a woman could be misread as defiance. A steady stare could be misconstrued as bold flirtation. And so the eyes dropped again and again, silencing their desires before they had a chance to grow. In portraits from the era, you can see this quiet rule captured forever. Women sit elegantly in their layered gowns, their hands placed neatly on their laps, their heads tilted slightly downward. Even in these still images, their eyes remain lowered, not just out of modesty, but because the pose itself had become a cultural symbol. It reflected everything society believed a woman should be: gentle, calm, and endlessly composed. There were rare women, however, who refused to follow this silent script. They lifted their eyes when they spoke, meeting others directly, startling those who were unaccustomed to such boldness. These women were often whispered about, too forward, too modern, too unwilling to accept their place. Yet they carried a quiet strength, one that challenged the rules simply by looking up. But most women continued to follow the unspoken tradition. They lived by it, moved by it, and communicated entire emotions through the soft rise and fall of their gaze. Each downward glance said something different depending on the moment: politeness, hesitation, discomfort, affection, or even quiet resistance. And so the Victorian world continued, its rooms filled with women who carried entire conversations in the silence of their eyes. They lived inside a language no one spoke out loud, a language that drifted between expectation and emotion, between who they were and who they were allowed to be. The story continues quietly, just beyond the tilt of their heads and the shadow of their lowered lashes.
Gloves that spoke louder than words. In the Victorian world, gloves were never just an accessory. They were a language, silent, refined, and woven entirely from rules that every woman was expected to understand. A pair of gloves could speak more clearly than a sentence, carrying messages of modesty, propriety, and social boundaries. The gentle rustle of kid leather carried meaning. The act of slipping a glove on or off carried meaning. Even the way a woman folded her fingers inside the fabric said something about who she was allowed to be. Girls learned the importance of gloves long before they understood why. Their mothers kept boxes of them in dresser drawers, white for daytime visits, dark shades for evening events, soft fabrics for casual walks, and delicate lace for special occasions. A woman's gloves were selected as carefully as her words, chosen to match the mood of a room, the level of formality, and the company she would keep. To appear in public without gloves was to appear incomplete, almost improper, as though she had forgotten a part of herself that society expected her to carry.
When a Victorian woman stepped outside, she did not think of gloves as optional. They protected her modesty, preserving the idea that her hands were not for public eyes. The bare hand, with its softness and warmth, was considered too intimate, too expressive. Gloves created a polite barrier between her and the world, allowing her to move through it without inviting the wrong kind of attention. Even something as simple as accepting a book, shaking a hand, or touching a teacup felt safer, quieter, more controlled when separated by a thin layer of fabric. In drawing rooms, gloves became symbols of behavior. A woman entered wearing them, sat down wearing them, and only after a polite pause, never too soon, never too slowly, was she permitted to remove them. The act itself was a delicate ritual. She would tug gently at each finger, fold the gloves neatly together, and place them in her lap. Removing them too quickly was seen as impulsive. Removing them too boldly was inappropriate. Every movement had to suggest calm intention. But perhaps the most intricate part of the silent glove language was how it expressed boundaries. A gloved hand offered to a gentleman meant respect and distance. A gloveless hand, rare, soft, unprotected, meant something far more intimate. To touch someone without gloves was an act weighed with meaning. A simple brush of the fingertips could carry an entire conversation, one that polite society would never allow in words. And so women guarded their hands carefully, revealing them only when absolutely necessary. The rules extended far beyond social visits. At dinner, gloves remained on until the moment food was served. Then they were removed gracefully and placed discreetly beside the plate. During church services, gloves stayed on at all times. During carriage rides, a woman kept them tightly fitted to protect her hands, not just from the cold, but from the impropriety of resting them openly in view. Even in her own home, if guests were present, gloves transformed the ordinary gestures of life into controlled, dignified movements. There were also unwritten expectations about glove color. Pale gloves suggested purity and youth, the softness of an untouched life. Dark gloves suggested formality, maturity, a seriousness reserved for events where emotions were expected to remain composed. A woman's choice of gloves hinted at her identity long before she spoke a word. Her social standing, her mood, her intention, and the nature of the event she was attending. Yet beneath all these rules, women discovered that gloves held unexpected power. They allowed a woman to control the impression she made. They softened the harshness of a gesture, concealed nervous tremors, and offered comfort in moments of anxiety. When uncertain, a woman could lightly pull at the edge of her glove, letting the motion calm her as she considered what to say. When embarrassed, she could hide her hands inside them, her fingers curling into the soft fabric where no one could see. For some, gloves became a kind of shield, a layer of dignity in a world that demanded constant composure. They allowed a woman to maintain distance, to protect her privacy, to keep a part of herself untouched. While her face had to remain calm and her posture perfect, her hands, trembling, tired, restless, could remain hidden, safe behind the quiet dignity of leather or cotton. There were also moments of quiet rebellion within this glove-bound world. Some women removed their gloves a heartbeat earlier than expected, signaling a subtle independence. Others chose colors slightly bolder than society approved, a gentle whisper of personality beneath the uniform surface of expectation. And there were women who, when no one was watching, let their bare hands rest freely on a windowsill, feeling the world directly, the cool glass, the warmth of sunlight, the softness of a summer breeze. Still, the rules remained firm for most. Gloves were both restriction and protection, both symbol and script. To follow the rules was to belong. To break them was to be noticed. And in a society where women were taught that being noticed was often a danger, gloves became a quiet safety, an elegant barrier between self and scrutiny. The story of Victorian womanhood is filled with such small rituals, tiny acts that shaped their days, their identities, their very movements. And while gloves seemed simple, they spoke volumes about a world built on gentleness, restraint, and the constant expectation of elegance. The story continues, gently and patiently, just as the gloves are folded away for the next chapter.
Letters written were, perhaps, the quietest battlefield of Victorian womanhood. They were expected to say everything without sounding like they said anything at all. Every stroke of ink had to be measured, every sentence polished into something soft, harmless, and impeccably polite. A Victorian woman's letter was not simply correspondence, it was a performance of virtue written in looping script. In the dim light of late afternoon, when the sun slanted across the parlor wallpaper like faded gold, Eleanor often sat at her writing desk and stared at the blank page before her. It looked peaceful, innocent almost, but she knew better. To her, the page was a mirror, one that demanded she display the exact version of herself society permitted. The truth had to be trimmed, feelings had to be softened, thoughts had to be filtered through the sieve of propriety. Only then could anything be allowed to reach another person's hands. The ink bottle on her desk was small, the kind that glimmered like a captured drop of night. Beside it sat her pen, a delicate steel nib fitted into a carved wooden handle her mother had given her at 15. It was meant to guide her, her mother said, toward becoming the kind of woman whose words never stirred trouble. Remember, her mother had whispered, a woman's letter must never reveal too much. It must never sound eager. It must never sound desperate. It must never sound impatient. A proper lady writes as though she is always composed, even when she is not. And so, Eleanor learned the art of restraint long before she learned the meaning of honesty. She dipped her pen in ink and let the first curve of a letter form, slow, graceful, obedient. Her handwriting was beautiful, but beauty meant nothing if the message was too bold. Victorian society believed a woman's true emotions were a kind of force to be contained, something that needed walls, lace, and proper margins to keep them from spilling over. Letters were those margins. A woman could write about the weather, she could write about her health, she could mention a book she had read or a caller who had visited, but she must never write plainly about longing, affection, frustration, or disappointment, unless, of course, she disguised them beneath layers of polite phrasing. Eleanor had become an expert at that. If she was lonely, she wrote, "My days remain calm and uneventful." If she was hurt, she wrote, "I trust this letter finds you well, as it finds me in good spirits." If she missed someone deeply, she wrote, "I hope our paths cross again in due time, when circumstances allow." The truth was tucked between the lines like a pressed flower, visible only to those who knew how to look. But most people never looked. The weight of this unspoken burden pressed heavily on her each time she began a new letter. Today she was writing to her cousin Adelaide, who lived 2 towns over and enjoyed the luxury of being bold in ways Eleanor could not. Adelaide always wrote with a liveliness that made her words feel like sudden gusts of fresh air. Eleanor adored it, but also feared imitating it. If her own letters ever sounded too spirited, her mother would gently remind her that
A woman's letter must never appear too expressive on paper. Appear, the most important verb in a Victorian woman's life. Not be proper, but appear proper. The distinction was small but cruel. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting her gaze drift across the quiet room. The patterned drapes cast shadows across the carpet, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the mantel clock. That ticking, steady and insistent, always reminded her of the expectations she lived under. Measured seconds, measured breaths, measured words. She continued writing. She told Adelaide about the garden, though she had not stepped outside in 2 days. She mentioned a book she had finished, though she had stopped halfway through because the heroine reminded her too painfully of herself. She added a line about helping her mother with sewing, though in truth she had pricked her fingers so many times that her mother tactfully suggested she take a rest. Every sentence was a small lie, shaped not by dishonesty, but by necessity. Victorian letters were expected to be neat, both in handwriting and in emotion. Messy feelings were not for paper. They were not for public consumption. They were not for anyone, really, except perhaps the silent thoughts kept locked behind a woman's eyes. Eleanor paused before writing the final lines of the letter. These were always the hardest. Every closing had to feel warm, but not familiar, polite, but not cold, affectionate, but not revealing. She carefully wrote, "Please know you are often in my thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from you at your convenience." It was the safest way to say, "I miss you. I wish I could speak to you freely. I wish I could be myself with someone." But even these hidden meanings would only be understood if Adelaide chose to see them. Most Victorian letters floated through the world like little boats, their messages sealed inside, never fully opened. Eleanor sanded the ink, folded the page, and pressed her wax seal into place. The seal bore her family's initial, a silent reminder that she belonged not only to herself, but to a lineage, a set of rules, a reputation that must never be tarnished. As she held the sealed letter in her hands, she felt a faint ache beneath her ribs. It was not quite sadness, not quite frustration, just a soft, persistent longing for a life where her words could be as unrestrained as her thoughts. But Victorian women did not wish for such things aloud. They barely allowed themselves to wish for them at all. And so Eleanor tucked the envelope into her writing case, smoothing it gently, as if smoothing away the emotion she had been careful to hide. The faint scent of sealing wax lingered in the air, warm and slightly sweet. Another letter written, another truth softened, another small piece of herself folded quietly out of sight. She extinguished the candle on her desk and watched a thin ribbon of smoke rise into the stillness of the room, a reminder that even silence leaves traces. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would write again. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would hide a little more of her heart in perfect cursive. And society would praise her for it.
The quiet ritual of tea hour. Tea hour in a Victorian home was far more than a simple pause in the day. It was a carefully choreographed ritual, a soft, predictable rhythm that shaped the lives of women from the moment the clock struck the appointed hour. In parlors adorned with lace, polished wood, and the faint scent of lavender, tea became the stage on which a woman's manners, posture, and restrained emotions were displayed for all to see. It was a quiet ceremony, but one heavy with expectation. Each gesture, each sip, each tilt of the teacup carried meaning, and each woman learned, early in life, that tea hour was a test of both patience and propriety. The preparation began long before the first cup was poured. Curtains were drawn to allow the gentle light to settle just so. Cushions were plumped,
the hearth dusted of its faint ash, and the table carefully arranged. A white linen cloth was smoothed across the polished surface, its edges aligned perfectly with the sides of the table. Silver spoons were set precisely next to bone-handled knives, and fine china teacups were placed at measured intervals. Nothing was left to chance. The room itself was a reflection of the order the women were expected to maintain, the order that would extend to their movements, expressions, and conversation once the ritual began. Women moved quietly, their steps softened by the thick carpets that muted the sound of their shoes. Each one understood that rushing, tripping, or any abrupt motion could disrupt the delicate balance of the moment. They carried trays of teapots and cups with careful attention, hands steady, back straight, shoulders relaxed yet controlled, as though the act of bringing tea to the table itself were a performance requiring grace and vigilance. The smallest slip, a tipped cup, a stain on the tablecloth, or a misaligned spoon would speak louder than words about one's attention to detail and refinement. When the first guest arrived, the ritual took on a new layer of significance. The hostess would greet them with a soft smile, slightly lowered eyes, and hands gloved or carefully arranged depending on the time of day. Conversation was polite, never too animated, yet never completely dull. It floated gently like the steam rising from the teacups. One spoke of flowers, of the weather, or of recent visits, always careful to remain within the bounds of propriety. Too much excitement, too loud a laugh, or even a sharp comment was considered inappropriate. Tea hour demanded calm observation, subtle engagement, and a quiet demonstration of the household sophistication. The pouring of tea itself was an art. The hostess held the teapot with a delicate yet assured grip, tilting it gently so that the liquid flowed smoothly into the waiting cup. Too fast, and the act would appear careless. Too slow, and it could be seen as hesitant or nervous. The creamer was lifted lightly, sugar added sparingly, and every stir executed with precision. There were unspoken rules about whether milk should be added first or last, about the manner in which one lifted the cup to the lips, and about how one returned it to the saucer. Each movement, while silent, communicated refinement, attention, and the woman's careful adherence to social expectation. Tea hour was also a subtle exercise in observation and restraint. A woman learned to notice how her guests held their spoons, how they lifted their cups, and how they positioned their hands when resting on the table. She adjusted her posture and gestures in response, creating harmony in the room. Eyes were lowered more often than raised, smiles soft, and words measured, but the attention given to these small signals was constant. It was a form of quiet communication, a language that required patience and mindfulness. For young girls growing up in Victorian homes, tea hour was a lesson in both etiquette and endurance. They watched their mothers and aunts, noting the precise angles of elbows, the gentle rise and fall of shoulders, the manner in which hands were folded in laps between sips. They learned to sit still for long stretches of time, listening to conversations about events in other households, about books, and about social engagements, all while maintaining the balance of perfect posture and restrained expression. A twitch, a frown, or a sudden movement could betray inexperience or carelessness. Even the act of drinking tea required careful control. The liquid itself was hot, the handle delicate, and the porcelain fragile. Women were expected to sip gracefully, never gulping or spilling, and to place the cup down with soft deliberation. They avoided slurping or making any sound that could disturb the serene atmosphere. In the eyes of Victorian society, a woman who could not drink her tea quietly might also be assumed unable to manage the household or navigate the complexities of polite conversation. Tea hour, in this sense, was both ritual and examination. Beyond its function as a test of etiquette, tea hour also provided a measured rhythm to the day, a pause, a quiet moment, and an opportunity for reflection.
Women would often allow their minds to wander as they sat with a warm cup in hand, letting the steam and aroma guide their thoughts gently. They considered their duties, their families, and the expectations awaiting them in the remainder of the day. Yet even this private reflection was tempered by the knowledge that the act itself was observed. They could not relax entirely. Even a glance away from the table required calculation and discretion. Guests, too, were bound by these unspoken rules. They mirrored the same careful attention to posture, speech, and small gestures. Conversations flowed in a soft rhythm, topics chosen with care to avoid offense or excess. Laughter was subdued, smiles polite, and eyes frequently lowered to demonstrate respect. Every action was noted, and every subtle deviation could be interpreted as commentary on character and upbringing. Tea hour, in this sense, was both a moment of refinement, instruction, and unspoken negotiation. Even the design and selection of teacups carried meaning. Fine porcelain, delicate patterns, and the presence of family crests spoke to lineage and propriety. Handling these objects required care and respect, further reinforcing the silent lessons of responsibility and discipline taught during each carefully arranged hour. A spill or mishap could suggest carelessness, while a smooth, measured pour indicated composure and training. The ritual extended to everyday domestic life beyond formal gatherings. Afternoon tea, whether with guests or within the household, became the framework around which the day's rhythm was measured. The act of preparing tea, measuring leaves, heating water, setting the table, provided structure, a sense of order, and the comforting repetition of deliberate actions. It allowed women to assert control over a small part of their world while adhering to the larger, restrictive societal expectations that governed them. Tea hour, in essence, was both an art and a discipline. It demanded grace, patience, and observation. It required careful attention to detail, silent communication, and subtle interpretation of social cues. For Victorian women, it was a quiet performance, a reflection of their ability to navigate a world that prized restraint, composure, and propriety above all else. And though it may seem mundane to the modern eye, tea hour was profoundly significant in shaping the rhythm, manners, and emotional discipline of Victorian womanhood. Each sip, each gesture, each polite word whispered a story of social expectation, personal endurance, and careful grace. A story that lives quietly in the memory of those who observe the faint traces of a bygone era.
Clothing that controlled every move. Victorian clothing was far more than fabric stitched together. It was an instrument of discipline, a silent teacher, and a constant reminder of the boundaries imposed on women. Every layer, from the tightly laced corset to the heavy skirts and stiff petticoats, shaped movement, posture, and behavior in ways that extended beyond mere fashion. Clothing in this era did not merely cover the body, it molded it, guided it, and restrained it, ensuring that a woman's presence remained elegant, composed, and above all, socially acceptable. From the earliest age, girls were introduced to the art of dressing with care and precision. Young children learned to step delicately into shoes that pinched slightly, to lace ribbons around their tiny wrists, and to bow slightly when adjusting the hems of their dresses. By adolescence, the lessons intensified. The corset, a ubiquitous garment in every woman's wardrobe, was not simply an item of clothing, it was a daily exercise in control. Its tight lacing forced upright posture, limited the depth of breath, and required every movement to be small, deliberate, and measured. It was a demanding discipline. Bending over too quickly risked discomfort or even injury. Sitting required careful alignment of skirts and petticoats. Walking demanded measured steps, and every turn of the head or tilt of the shoulder had to be precise.
The very fabric of a woman's dress dictated her motions, instilling a constant awareness of how she occupied space. Through these garments, Victorian society ensured that elegance became habitual, and deviation from the expected comportment was nearly impossible. The materials themselves played a role in shaping behavior. Stiff fabrics, layered under delicate silks, restricted the ease of movement. Petticoats made sweeping gestures cumbersome, while hoop skirts added weight and structure that demanded balance and care. Corsets, made of whalebone or steel, compressed the torso and guided the shoulders back, ensuring a posture that exuded composure. Even the sleeves were designed to encourage restraint, long, fitted, or adorned with lace and buttons that prevented abrupt, careless motions. Every morning, dressing was a ritual. Women rose early to spend hours layering garments in perfect sequence. First came the undergarments, then the corset, carefully tightened to achieve the correct silhouette. Petticoats followed, arranged to create fullness without obstructing movement. Over these, the main dress was draped, adjusted and pinned, ensuring that seams fell neatly and hems did not catch underfoot. Finally, gloves, hats, and accessories completed the ensemble. Each article was both a symbol of refinement and a tool of control, demanding attention and patience. Movement in these garments was always an act of conscious effort. Walking required a soft, measured pace. Women learned to lift each foot lightly, placing it precisely, to not snag skirts or tip the balance of a hoop. Sitting was an exercise in elegance. Crossing legs was rare, and instead, ankles were pressed together, knees slightly turned, and skirts arranged to flow gently over the lap. Rising from a chair was slow, deliberate, and always graceful, often assisted by the hands placed along the edges of the chair to maintain poise. The control imposed by clothing extended to social encounters. Every step taken in a drawing room, every gesture offered during tea, every inclination of the head was guided by the garments that shaped the body. Even a simple reach for a book, a teacup, or a fan required awareness of the layers beneath the hands and arms. To move freely without awareness was to risk entanglement, imbalance, or public disapproval. Clothing in this way taught women restraint by necessity, blending societal expectation with physical limitation. Fashion was also a language of social class and decorum. The weight, material, and embellishment of clothing communicated wealth, status, and propriety. Lighter fabrics and simpler designs indicated youth, innocence, or practicality, while rich silks, elaborate lace, and embroidered details signaled refinement, maturity, and wealth. Each ensemble informed observers of the wearer's place in society, the household's attention to etiquette, and the personal discipline of the woman herself. It was impossible to separate clothing from social meaning. Every fold and seam carried significance. The restrictions imposed by dress also taught women patience and endurance. A long walk, a climb of stairs, or even a turn on a polished floor became exercises in balance and self-control. Activities that might seem ordinary today were transformed into careful choreographies, demanding continuous awareness. The body learned to anticipate the limits set by corsets and skirts, internalizing a behavior of poise that extended beyond clothing and into every gesture and expression. Even the act of sleep was shaped by anticipation of daily dress. Women prepared their nightgowns and undergarments with care, knowing that tomorrow's attire would demand equal attention. They folded corsets and laced ribbons, smoothing fabrics so that each morning would begin with ritualized precision. Clothing became an extension of thought, shaping not just appearance, but the very rhythm of life. The impact of these garments extended beyond physical control into the emotional and psychological sphere.
constant awareness of posture, movement, and appearance instilled a sense of vigilance, a perpetual attention to detail that mirrored the expectations of society. A misstep or careless gesture was never entirely private. It could be observed, commented on, or remembered. Clothing taught women to anticipate the gaze of others, to internalize social rules, and to live in a state of perpetual awareness and grace. Young women often developed a sense of duality, the inner self beneath the garments and the self as seen by society. The outer body was disciplined, constrained, and polished. The inner self was alive with thoughts, frustrations, and desires, yet largely invisible to those who observed only the surface. Clothing, in this sense, became a lens through which society judged character and virtue. A well-dressed woman with measured movements was assumed disciplined, obedient, and morally upright, regardless of the life lived within the layers. In portraits from the era, this discipline is visible. Women sit with backbones straight, hands delicately arranged over skirts, feet positioned precisely, and eyes soft yet controlled. Every element of their attire, from the tiniest bow to the largest bustle, serves a purpose. The image is serene, elegant, and carefully calculated. The slightest deviation, a slouch, a twisted hem, a loose sleeve, would have been immediately noticed in reality, but within the portrait, the ideal of control is frozen in time. Beyond public observation, clothing also reinforced self-control in private. Even when alone, women were conditioned to maintain poise, understanding that habits of restraint cultivated in dress would translate into all areas of life, speaking softly, moving deliberately, smiling politely, and controlling emotion. The body, molded by fabric, became an instrument of social conformity, a constant reminder that elegance was as much about how one moved as how one appeared. Yet despite the restrictions, there were small opportunities for subtle rebellion and individuality. Accessories, jewelry, brooches, ribbons, offered hints of personality. A slightly brighter ribbon or a unique pattern in a dress allowed a woman to express herself quietly without violating the broader code of propriety. Even small adjustments in the fit of a sleeve or the tilt of a hat could convey confidence or temperament. Within the rigid framework of fashion, women discovered tiny freedoms, controlled, subtle, and almost invisible to the untrained eye. Clothing in this way was not merely decorative, it was formative. It taught control, endurance, observation, and patience. It demanded awareness of one's body, one's surroundings, and the expectations of others. Every layer, every seam, every fold contributed to the creation of a woman who could move through the world gracefully, invisibly, navigating the complex rules of Victorian society. And so, as women donned their elaborate gowns each morning, tightened their corsets, and arranged their skirts just so, they performed a silent daily ritual. They learned to move not only within the limitations of fabric and bone, but within the constraints of expectation, modesty, and propriety. Clothing shaped them, controlled them, and taught them to inhabit a world where every motion was observed, every gesture
conversations that could never go too far. In Victorian society, speech was an art of restraint, a performance where words were measured, softened, and carefully weighed against the invisible but exacting rules of propriety. Women learned early that conversations were not opportunities to express freely, but delicate dances, choreographed with pauses, gentle smiles, and subtle gestures. There were topics to embrace, topics to avoid, and an almost infinite number of ways in which a misstep could reveal more than was socially permissible. Conversations that could never go too far were as essential to a lady's survival as the clothes she wore or the smile she carried. From the drawing room to the garden, speech was governed by invisible boundaries. Women were trained to avoid words that hinted at emotion too raw, intellect too sharp, or opinion too bold. A story about a visit to a market could be shared, but only in terms that emphasized calm observation and propriety. A remark on health could be offered, but never with complaint or exaggeration. Anything that revealed dissatisfaction, impatience, or desire to challenge authority was subtly, silently censored. In conversation, restraint was not merely etiquette, it was survival. Girls learned this early. Even play, in the presence of family or visitors, was an opportunity to practice moderation. They were taught to modulate their voices, avoiding shrill tones or unsteady laughter. They learned to pause before answering, weighing each word against the standards of politeness. They learned that interruptions, even well-intentioned ones, were improper, and that a question that probed too deeply could invite reprimand. In this way, conversations that could never go too far became a silent education, shaping not just speech, but thought itself. In households where multiple generations lived under one roof, women became observers of speech as much as participants. They noticed how their mothers and aunts navigated dialogue with visitors, detecting the subtle rhythms of compliance and the tiny allowances of rebellion. When the conversation turned to the weather, the proper level of enthusiasm was expected, a smile, a nod, and a softly phrased opinion. When the discussion turned to books or events, caution governed the words chosen. Political discussion was rare, intellectual debate rarer still. Society discouraged women from wandering into territory that might make them appear forward, opinionated, or improperly curious. Even within families, the rules applied. Complaints about discomfort, disagreement with a relative, or frustration over household duties had to be tempered with polite phrasing. A woman might say, "The rooms feel warm today," instead of admitting fatigue from too many layers of clothing. She might remark, "I find the needlework most engaging," while secretly longing for freedom from the constant pressure of perfection. Every word was a balance between truth and appearance, between desire and duty. Visitors further complicated matters. When guests were present, conversations became exercises of vigilance. Women had to listen as carefully as they spoke, interpreting tone, timing, and word choice with precision. A compliment had to be received gracefully, an inquiry answered softly, and even minor disagreements skirted with careful diplomacy. Topics that could ignite curiosity, display ignorance, or suggest impropriety were to be avoided entirely. A lady's speech was a map of polite boundaries, guiding her safely through the terrain of social expectation. In some households, women devised clever ways to express themselves while remaining within the confines of etiquette. A gentle anecdote could hint at dissatisfaction, a soft joke could veil criticism, or a delicate metaphor could reveal longing. Words were like layered garments, outwardly simple, inwardly rich with meaning for those capable of reading them. This subtlety became an unspoken measure of intelligence, wit, and discretion. The art of restraint extended even to letters. Conversations carried beyond the home and whispered comments. Women were taught that speech could be monitored and that words once spoken could travel faster than intentions. A careless phrase might reach ears ill-prepared to understand nuance, leading to gossip, judgment, or social consequence. Conversations that could never go too far were a safeguard against scrutiny, protecting both reputation and opportunity. Even when alone with trusted companions, caution remained a habit.
women internalized the rhythm of restraint so deeply that speaking freely became almost impossible. Pauses before sentences, measured intonation, and softly circumscribed topics were habitual. The mind itself was trained to anticipate boundaries, censoring impulses before they reached the lips. In this way, conversation was not merely a social practice, it became a mirror of the inner discipline that Victorian life demanded. Social events magnified these pressures. During parlor visits, garden walks, or formal calls, women observed the subtleties of dialogue in others, calibrating their own words to avoid missteps. A compliment had to be returned with equal grace, an inquiry answered with neither too much enthusiasm nor too little. Laughter had to be gentle, smiles soft, and opinions neutral. Even the act of listening required skill. Overeager attention suggested forwardness. Indifference implied rudeness. Women navigated these interactions with careful choreography, ensuring that their speech neither threatened nor overstepped the invisible perimeter of acceptability. The lessons of controlled conversation had long-term effects. Women learned to navigate uncertainty, manage emotion, and present themselves with strategic discretion. They became skilled readers of tone and context, adept at gauging reactions and adapting responses. Yet, these skills often came at the cost of genuine self-expression. Thoughts were filtered, desires restrained, and individuality quieted under layers of social expectation. Conversation, once a medium for connection, became a vehicle of control. Some women attempted subtle rebellion within the bounds of propriety. A carefully timed anecdote might challenge a guest's assumptions. A measured critique might hint at intelligence, or a nuanced question could test the limits of what was acceptable. These small acts were both daring and discreet, never overtly breaking rules, but quietly asserting autonomy. Conversation in these moments became a battlefield of subtle resistance and delicate negotiation. Despite these limitations, the Victorian emphasis on measured speech cultivated elegance and thoughtfulness. Women learned to weigh words, appreciate nuance, and communicate without excess. Each conversation was an opportunity to demonstrate self-control, discernment, and poise. In this way, society's restrictions fostered a particular form of sophistication, even as they suppressed full expression. Conversations that could never go too far were not merely rules, they were rituals. They structured daily life, reinforced social hierarchies, and trained women in the intricate balance of restraint and subtlety. The very act of speaking became an art form, requiring constant attention to propriety, observation of social cues, and careful calibration of emotion. Words, like the clothing they wore, were instruments of discipline, shaping identity as surely as any corset or glove. And so, in every parlor, drawing room, and garden path, women practiced this art, speaking softly, listening carefully, and learning the endless rhythm of moderation. Each conversation, while outwardly simple, carried the weight of expectation, the refinement of restraint, and the unspoken promise of composure. In their words, Victorian women built the quiet architecture of their lives. Every sentence measured, every story tempered, and every phrase a testament to discipline, patience, and the delicate navigation of society's rigid expectations.
The rule of never walking alone. In Victorian society, the simple act of walking was rarely as straightforward as it appears today. For women, every step outside carried weight, expectation, and a silent code of conduct. The rule of never walking alone was one of the most pervasive, subtly reinforced through family guidance, social observation, and the ever-watchful eyes of the neighborhood. Walking unaccompanied was not merely inconvenient, it was a breach of propriety.
a visible deviation from the standards that defined respectability. Girls learned this rule early. Mothers taught them to wait for companions, to align their walks with others, and to avoid streets where the path might stretch too long without the protective presence of family or acquaintance. A lone walk could suggest recklessness or impropriety, implying curiosity beyond the bounds of modesty. Even a seemingly trivial stroll could invite gossip, criticism, or unwanted attention. The path, as ordinary as it seemed, became a stage on which a woman's conduct was performed and observed. The social implications of walking alone extended beyond reputation. Victorian towns and cities were not without risk, real or imagined. Streets were uneven, dark corners abundant, and the presence of strangers often unpredictable. Yet the rule was less about physical safety than about perception. A solitary woman could be misjudged, her independence interpreted as boldness or defiance. Society equated accompaniment with protection, virtue, and social grace, making the absence of a companion a mark of deviation. Even seemingly trivial strolls within private gardens or along familiar avenues adhered to the same expectations. A woman was rarely truly alone. If she stepped outside, she did so with an attendant, a sibling, or a close friend. The presence of a companion ensured proper conversation, measured gait, and polite posture. Even casual observation was a form of social training. One walked, yes, but one also performed the subtleties of refinement for the silent audience of family and neighbors. The act of walking became a microcosm of Victorian discipline, every footstep deliberate, every glance intentional, and every motion observed. For young women, learning to walk correctly with others was a crucial education. Side by side with a mother or sister, they learned to coordinate pace and posture, ensuring alignment of body and skirt, maintaining balance over uneven surfaces, and moving with the rhythm expected in public. The art of walking together demanded attentiveness, patience, and discretion. It was not enough to move forward, one had to move forward gracefully, with awareness of the space occupied and the impression projected. The street, the path, the garden walk all became classrooms for the silent education of decorum. Accompaniment carried further significance during visits, errands, or informal strolls. A chaperone, a brother, or a cousin provided not only protection but a social buffer. The companion mediated the interactions, offered polite conversation, and ensured that the woman adhered to the constraints of propriety. Walking alone, without this buffer, risked drawing undue attention or prompting suspicion about a woman's intentions or character. Victorian society was meticulous in maintaining appearances. The solitary figure disrupted the expected tableau. Even the choice of route was dictated by etiquette. Main streets, familiar pathways, and well-trodden gardens were acceptable. Secluded alleys, unfrequented roads, or unknown pathways were to be avoided. To step outside without accompaniment and into unfamiliar territory was not only risky in practice, but improper in perception. The presence of other people, even casual passers-by, provided an additional layer of social validation, confirming that the woman's movements were controlled, correct, and fully observed. Victorian women also learned the psychological impact of walking in pairs or groups. The shared journey allowed them to mirror one another's posture, gestures, and measured pace, reinforcing the discipline of elegance. It allowed for quiet correction, subtle guidance, and mutual reinforcement of social codes.
Alone, a woman risked slipping into gestures, expressions, or motions not yet polished by observation. Accompaniment thus became both a safeguard and a tool, teaching grace through practice and example. The rule of never walking alone also influenced clothing and accessories. Dresses were arranged to prevent tangling, hats were pinned securely, and parasols were held with attention, all coordinated with the steps of companions. Even the placement of gloves and the tilt of a bonnet were adjusted to maintain harmony in motion. Movement, dress, and social expectation were inseparable, each influencing the other in subtle but constant ways. There were occasional instances of discretion, where young women ventured briefly into solitude, perhaps to retrieve water from a distant pump, or to walk to a family garden without visible company. Even then, caution governed every decision. Steps were measured, gaze lowered, and movements minimized. These moments of quiet independence were small, almost imperceptible acts of rebellion, tempered by fear of observation and the ever-present rule that the safest walk was one undertaken with company. The rule of accompaniment shaped not only physical movement, but also emotional perception. The presence of a companion offered comfort, the reassurance of shared vigilance, and the ability to communicate discreetly without verbal intrusion. It became a structure within which women learned to negotiate social landscapes, observe propriety, and maintain dignity. Walking alone was not merely socially discouraged. It disrupted the rhythm of guidance, support, and communal discipline so integral to daily life. As girls matured, the rule extended to courtship, social calls, and visits to neighbors. Young women were chaperoned carefully, often by mothers or older sisters, ensuring that even the shortest walks adhered to expectations of propriety. Every movement in public carried the silent scrutiny of society, reinforcing boundaries, caution, and careful self-presentation. The lesson was clear. Independence could only be expressed safely within the visible protection of accompaniment. Even as women walked side by side with companions, moving with perfect grace and soft-spoken conversation, the underlying lesson remained clear. Independence was not forbidden, but it was always circumscribed, always guided, and always performed within the quiet framework of propriety.
When being too educated was considered improper. In Victorian society, education was a paradox for women. It was encouraged only to the extent that it made them more refined, more accomplished, and more suitable for marriage. Yet it was strictly limited in scope and depth. Knowledge was to be cultivated as an ornament, not a tool. Learning was a means of refinement, never a pursuit of autonomy. A woman could read, write, and paint with grace, but to seek understanding too earnestly, to question too boldly, or to master subjects beyond the narrow confines of domesticity risked scandal, disapproval, and social isolation. In the carefully ordered world of Victorian propriety, being too educated was considered not merely unusual, it was improper. The boundaries of acceptable learning were invisible, yet rigorously enforced. Young girls were encouraged to study literature, music, drawing, and needlework, but lessons in science, politics, or philosophy were deemed unnecessary, even dangerous. Knowledge was to be cultivated as an ornament, not a tool. Learning was a means of refinement, never a pursuit of autonomy. A woman could read, write, and paint with grace, but to seek understanding too earnestly, to question too boldly, or to master subjects beyond the narrow confines of domesticity risked scandal, disapproval, and social isolation. In the carefully ordered world of Victorian propriety, being too educated was considered not merely unusual, it was improper. The boundaries of acceptable learning were invisible, yet rigorously enforced. Young girls were encouraged to study literature, music, drawing, and needlework, but lessons in science, politics, or philosophy were deemed unnecessary, even dangerous. Knowledge was to embellish femininity, not challenge it. A well-read woman was admired for her polite observations of classic novels or her delicate sketches of landscapes, but admiration turned to criticism if her intellect seemed to threaten social equilibrium or draw attention to her independent mind. Eleanor had encountered this paradox firsthand. From a young age, she displayed a curiosity that stretched beyond the acceptable limits. Questions about why the seasons changed, inquiries about distant lands, and a fascination with maps, inventions, and ideas that her tutors delicately sidestepped. Her mother often smiled politely, praising her interest, yet steering her back toward poetry, history, and etiquette manuals. Education, Eleanor learned, was both a gift and a cage. It could elevate her in society if she applied it discreetly, but it could isolate her if applied too freely. Books themselves were carefully chosen instruments of social instruction. Novels were preferred for moral guidance and literary elegance, history for a sense of lineage and propriety, and poetry for emotional refinement. Scientific texts, political treatises, or philosophical works were reserved for men or for private study under supervision, never for public display. A woman reading beyond her prescribed boundaries risked being perceived as unfeminine or overly ambitious. The act of education, therefore, was always entwined with performance. One learned enough to demonstrate refinement, but not enough to suggest independence. Instruction in schools and homes reflected these values. Young women were trained in neat handwriting, arithmetic sufficient for household management, and conversational knowledge suitable for social occasions. Tutors emphasized the ability to discuss literature, appreciate music, and observe social norms, but discouraged debate, analysis, or critical inquiry. The curriculum was designed to shape intellect without fostering audacity, to cultivate curiosity while avoiding defiance. To excel in approved areas was praised. To excel beyond them was suspect. Even in private correspondence, the limits of education became evident. Letters between women often demonstrated intelligence cloaked in careful phrasing. A lady might reference a new book, an idea encountered in conversation, or a mildly advanced lesson in language or history, but she rarely ventured beyond socially sanctioned knowledge. To do so risked misunderstanding, gossip, or censure. Knowledge had to be applied delicately, like lace over a firm yet constrained structure, decorative, appreciated, and contained. The societal fear of overly educated women stemmed from assumptions about independence and influence. A woman who read widely or thought deeply was imagined to question authority, challenge social norms, or prioritize personal ambition over family and duty. Education became a subtle threat, not because it corrupted morality, but because it illuminated possibilities beyond the domestic sphere. Therefore, rules around learning were never solely about content. They were about maintaining a balance of power, ensuring women's compliance with a tightly ordered social world. Victorian women internalized these lessons early. Eleanor, for example, understood that expressing too much knowledge could lead to subtle punishment, cold glances, diverted conversation, or gentle reprimands. She learned to calibrate her curiosity, asking questions in ways that suggested refinement rather than defiance. Observation became a skill as crucial as study. She noted which subjects provoked discomfort, which ideas drew praise, and which inquiries were safest to pursue. Knowledge became a dance of discretion, a negotiation between desire and propriety. Even leisure activities reflected this tension. Afternoon reading might include novels with moral lessons or histories of distant lands told in simplified language. Drawing, music, and embroidery allowed intellectual engagement without appearing threatening.
Games and puzzles were sometimes introduced to exercise the mind, but always in the context of refinement. Private reflection could stray further, yet expression remained bounded. The internal world of thought was freer than the external, but it was nonetheless circumscribed by the expectations embedded in dress, demeanor, and social engagement. For women who pushed the boundaries, education could be both liberation and source of frustration. Eleanor occasionally found herself captivated by scientific treatises or philosophical musings she encountered in her brother's studies. She read with eagerness, absorbed by ideas too advanced to share openly. Yet, she had to conceal her excitement, lest it suggest ambition beyond propriety. To articulate her discoveries would risk criticism. To ignore them would deny her curiosity. In this tension, knowledge became both a private solace and a quiet burden. Tutors, too, were often constrained by the same rules. They encouraged accomplishment in manners, arts, and literature, but hesitated to cultivate independent thought. Even the encouragement to ask questions was often paired with admonitions. Remember, dear, that knowledge must be applied delicately. There is wisdom in knowing how much to reveal and prudence in restraint. In this way, education itself became a subtle mechanism of social control, teaching intellect while simultaneously shaping behavior. The fear of overly educated women also affected marriage prospects. A man of standing might admire a wife's refinement, her ability to converse about literature, music, or society, but would be wary of a woman whose learning suggested ambition, defiance, or independence. Knowledge had to be ornamental, never threatening. It had to enhance, not eclipse domestic roles. To exceed these expectations was to risk social isolation or to become perceived as unsuitable for the carefully structured hierarchy of family and society. Yet, within these limitations, women discovered subtle strategies for intellectual engagement. Study groups, shared readings, and private discussions allowed exploration of ideas within socially sanctioned boundaries. Literature offered a window to distant thoughts and lives. History provided lessons in strategy and morality, and art and music became vehicles for expression beyond words. These avenues permitted the cultivation of intellect while avoiding overt impropriety, a delicate balance demanding discretion and constant awareness. The pursuit of knowledge became an exercise in patience and subtlety. Women like Eleanor learned to savor forbidden ideas in silence, to nurture curiosity privately, and to share insights only when safety and propriety allowed. Learning, therefore, was never solely about facts or skill. It was a practice in self-restraint, judgment, and social navigation. Knowledge was a treasure hidden beneath the layers of expectation, accessible to those who could navigate the intricate rules without revealing themselves too fully. Even conversations among women required calibration. Discussing ideas too advanced could draw criticism or gossip, while avoiding intellectual engagement entirely risked appearing dull or unrefined. Skill lay in balancing depth and discretion. Allusion, suggestion, and careful phrasing became tools for intellectual expression within social bounds. Women learned to communicate meaningfully without transgressing limits, turning language into a subtle dance of thought, politeness,
hosting guests with perfect calmness. In Victorian households, the arrival of guests was more than a social engagement. It was a meticulously orchestrated performance, a ritual demanding perfect calmness and careful attention from the hostess. For women, the act of hosting was a subtle exercise in discipline, patience, and observation, one that required mastery of both outward appearance and inner composure. Every gesture, smile, and word was measured against the standards of propriety, ensuring that the household projected order, refinement, and impeccable taste. Preparation for hosting began long before visitors arrived. The parlor, dining room, or drawing room was meticulously arranged.
Furniture was polished until it gleamed, upholstery carefully brushed to remove every trace of dust, and carpets swept and fluffed to perfection. Curtains were drawn to allow gentle light to filter in, but never in a way that created shadows or glare. The air itself was curated. Subtle scents from fresh flowers, candles, or mild perfumes created an atmosphere of calm sophistication. A single misplaced object could disrupt the delicate balance, and women were trained to attend to every detail without visible effort. The hostess herself was a living extension of the household's order. She rose early to dress, selecting garments that were elegant yet unobtrusive, ensuring that movement remained fluid, gestures precise, and posture unwavering. Hair was styled to perfection, jewelry chosen to complement attire without drawing excessive attention, and gloves worn according to the subtleties of etiquette. In her appearance, she embodied the calm, measured grace expected of every woman tasked with welcoming others into her home. Greeting guests required both attention and restraint. The hostess smiled softly, offered a polite nod, and extended hands with a gentle firmness. Eyes were lowered just enough to convey modesty and respect, yet lifted at intervals to acknowledge the visitor's presence. Conversation began softly, guided by observation and carefully chosen words. Compliments on attire, inquiries about health, or mild remarks on the weather allowed dialogue to flow without overstepping boundaries. Every word was weighed for tone, cadence, and implication, ensuring that the interaction remained entirely within socially acceptable limits. The ritual extended to seating arrangements. Guests were guided to chairs with discreet gestures, taking care to maintain spatial harmony and allow comfortable movement of skirts and dresses. The placement of cushions, the angle of chairs, and even the alignment of feet were observed with subtle attention, creating an environment where comfort and decorum coexisted. In this careful choreography, the hostess's calmness was paramount, every action deliberate, every adjustment unhurried, and every glance attentive without appearing critical. Serving refreshments was equally precise. Tea, water, or delicacies were offered with measured grace. Cups were poured without haste, plates arranged meticulously, and utensils handled lightly but confidently. The movement of trays, the placement of saucers, and the gentle passing of treats were all executed with awareness, ensuring that no spilling, tipping, or misalignment occurred. Guests, in turn, mirrored this careful rhythm of motion and interaction that reflected the household's cultivated poise. Conversation continued under the watchful guidance of the hostess. Topics were chosen to remain safe yet engaging. Recent visits, literature, music, or local events provided gentle subjects for dialogue. Opinions were offered sparingly, laughter kept soft, and questions posed with a quiet curiosity that invited response without challenging propriety. The hostess listened attentively, noting inflection, tone, and subtle shifts in expression, adapting her own responses to maintain balance, harmony, and calm authority. In this way, hosting became an intricate interplay of observation and restraint, each participant adjusting seamlessly to social norms. Even small mishaps were managed with discretion and composure. A spilled cup, a slightly askew cushion, or a dropped utensil was addressed without alarm, the correction subtle and unnoticeable. Calmness in the face of minor errors demonstrated both control and competence, reinforcing the household's image of refinement. In Victorian culture, the perception of perfect calmness was as valuable as the act itself. It reflected the hostess's ability to govern the environment, manage relationships, and maintain social grace under all circumstances. Young women observed these interactions closely, internalizing lessons that would guide them in their own future roles.
They learned to anticipate needs, respond to subtle cues, and regulate emotion under scrutiny. The hostess's calmness was not merely aesthetic, it was instructional, teaching poise, patience, and the importance of measured behavior. Girls practiced these lessons through imitation, gradually absorbing the delicate balance of control, observation, and social grace required in hosting. The presence of multiple guests increased the complexity of the task. Women had to manage the rhythm of conversation, ensuring that each voice was heard while preventing any single topic or opinion from dominating. They subtly guided discussions, encouraged participation without asserting dominance, and maintained an atmosphere where decorum was preserved. Even laughter, applause for a story, or shared surprise had to be tempered with moderation. In this careful orchestration, the hostess's skill lay not only in what she said or did, but in her ability to influence the entire room without overt direction. Spatial awareness was also critical. Movement between chairs, proximity to the hearth, and positioning near tables or windows required careful attention. The hostess navigated the room with a soft, measured gait, ensuring that no skirts tangled, no furniture was disturbed, and no guest felt crowded. Her presence subtly signaled expectations for posture, behavior, and attention, guiding the group through an unspoken code of etiquette that regulated both speech and movement. Even the timing of actions mattered. Tea was poured at intervals, conversation allowed to flow but not stagnate, and refreshment served with rhythm. Guests were observed for fatigue, distraction, or discomfort, and adjustments were made with subtle gestures, a gentle offer of a seat, a quiet suggestion to admire a view from the window, or a soft hand motion to signal the passing of a tray. Through such attentiveness, the hostess created an environment where calmness was both maintained and modeled, providing reassurance and structure to all present. The psychological component of hosting was significant. Women developed a dual awareness, attention to their own composure and vigilance toward others' reactions. This mental discipline demanded continuous observation, the ability to anticipate social missteps, and the skill to intervene gracefully when necessary. Hosting, therefore, was as much a matter of intellect as of posture or movement. It required emotional regulation, perceptiveness, and the ability to navigate complex social interactions with subtlety and grace. Hosting also reinforced hierarchy and relationship dynamics. Guests were positioned according to age, rank, and relationship to the hostess. Conversation was moderated to ensure inclusion without overstepping social bounds. The hostess's calmness conveyed authority, mastery, and discretion, reinforcing her role as the arbiter of decorum. In doing so, she maintained not only the order of the household, but the perception of competence and refinement essential to social standing. Even small details, often overlooked by modern observers, were critical. The tilt of a teacup, the folding of a napkin, the positioning of a chair, or the soft adjustment of a sleeve all contributed to the overall impression of calm competence. These seemingly minor gestures were imbued with significance, signaling attention, refinement, and control. Guests, consciously or not, absorbed these signals, evaluating both the hostess and the household according to the standards of decorum. Hosting, therefore, became an extended performance of patience, vigilance, and restraint. Women learned to balance attention to detail with outward composure, to manage conversation and movement simultaneously, and to project calm confidence in every action. The skill required was immense. It demanded memory, observation, discretion, and the ability to act with precision under scrutiny. Yet for those who mastered it, hosting became a source of pride, a demonstration of refinement, and a quiet assertion of capability.
Young women trained under these expectations gradually.
Mealtime manners that defined character. In Victorian society, meals were far more than sustenance. They were performances of discipline, decorum, and social order. Every aspect of dining, from the placement of utensils to the pacing of conversation, was imbued with expectation. Women, in particular, were judged not solely by the taste of the food they prepared or consumed, but by the elegance, restraint, and character demonstrated at the table. Mealtime manners were considered a reflection of personal virtue, moral cultivation, and social refinement, teaching lessons that extended far beyond the immediate act of eating. Preparation for meals began long before the first course appeared. The table was arranged with careful precision, polished silverware aligned perfectly, crystal glasses positioned symmetrically, and plates laid out in strict order. Napkins were folded with geometric exactness, serving trays lined with delicate linens, and chairs placed to allow graceful, unobstructed movement. Even the lighting of candles or the drawing of curtains was choreographed to create an atmosphere conducive to calm, measured dining. The environment itself was as much a teacher as the food it contained. The act of sitting at the table was the first test of discipline. Women were trained from childhood to approach their seats with measured steps, lower themselves gracefully, and arrange their skirts and petticoats with care. A slight misalignment of posture could attract subtle disapproval, and every gesture was scrutinized for elegance and propriety. The physical constraints imposed by clothing, corsets, layered skirts, and fitted bodices demanded attentiveness to balance and movement, ensuring that each participant maintained composure throughout the meal. Utensil usage was an exercise in both precision and restraint. Forks and knives were held lightly yet firmly, applied in smooth, controlled motions, and replaced carefully between bites. Crumbs were brushed unobtrusively aside, while napkins were unfolded, refolded, and adjusted with subtle attention. Each action, however small, was read as an indicator of upbringing, character, and refinement. To violate these norms, even slightly, was to risk signaling carelessness, ignorance, or a lack of self-control. Pacing was equally important. Eating too quickly suggested hunger or impatience. Eating too slowly could appear affected or awkward. Women were instructed to follow a rhythm dictated by propriety, moderate bites, soft chewing, and careful swallowing. Conversation was interspersed with silence, allowing the meal itself to maintain its own quiet dignity. The timing of raising a glass, passing a dish, or responding to a remark was all measured to ensure harmony at the table. Mealtime became a choreography of behavior, a performance in which every motion was deliberate. Conversation during meals was similarly constrained. Topics were chosen to engage without provoking or offending. Discussions of literature, household matters, and mild observations of society were considered appropriate. Subjects that hinted at controversy, emotion, or impropriety were strictly avoided. Even laughter and commentary were moderated, smiles gentle, tones soft, and gestures subtle. Through these interactions, women learned to navigate social dynamics with grace, balancing engagement with discretion. The lessons extended to observation of others. Women monitored companions' actions and reactions, learning to anticipate needs, offer dishes politely, and adjust posture and behavior in response to subtle cues. The act of eating became an intricate social study, requiring attentiveness not only to one's own conduct, but to the overall rhythm of the table. Through observation, women developed the ability to regulate both their own behavior and the atmosphere of the meal, reinforcing calm,
composure, and propriety. Children in Victorian households received these lessons early. They were seated in accordance with rank and age, taught the use of utensils with patience, and guided in correct posture and decorum. Mistakes were corrected gently, often through demonstration rather than rebuke, allowing young learners to internalize norms gradually. By adolescence, these practices had become habitual, shaping the rhythm, tone, and manner of all dining experiences. The placement and handling of food reflected social expectations as well. Servings were moderate and balanced, arranged to allow ease of access without excess. Reaching across the table required care and politeness. Speaking while chewing was avoided, and requests were made with subtle phrasing and soft tone. Women learned that mealtime was not merely about nourishment, but about performance, perception, and the cultivation of patience and attentiveness. Even small gestures held significance. Offering a dish, refilling a cup, or passing bread was done with attention to eye contact, hand placement, and timing. The subtleties of these actions reinforced social hierarchy, relationships, and etiquette. A misstep, a too eager reach, a loud laugh, or a slouched posture could disrupt the atmosphere, drawing notice and quietly diminishing perceived character. In the Victorian mind, propriety was inseparable from morality. Refinement at the table mirrored virtue and self-discipline. The effect of these lessons was pervasive. Women learned to integrate manners, observation, and restraint into every social interaction. Eating became a classroom in miniature, the body disciplined, the mind attentive, and the social environment carefully managed. Through repetition, these practices instilled habits of patience, awareness, and measured behavior, shaping character as surely as books, clothing, or conversation. Hosting or attending larger meals heightened these challenges. Women had to manage multiple interactions, attending to guests' comfort, facilitating smooth conversation, and observing hierarchy and protocol. Each action, from the smallest gesture to the timing of responses, contributed to a tableau of grace and composure. Hosting required mastery of multiple skills simultaneously: awareness, tact, poise, and self-restraint. Mealtime manners thus served as both instruction and display, teaching refinement while demonstrating capability. Even in private or informal settings, the principles persisted. Breakfasts, tea, and casual family meals offered opportunities for reinforcement of proper conduct. Children observed adults carefully, absorbing rules of posture, speech, and etiquette. In these quiet, everyday moments, the discipline of the table became second nature, internalized through repetition and subtle correction. The lessons learned at the Victorian table shaped not only dining habits, but broader social comportment, guiding behavior across the spectrum of daily life. Attention to detail extended to timing, rhythm, and sensory awareness. The clinking of utensils, the soft pouring of tea, the movement of plates and glasses, all were conducted with deliberate attention to volume, placement, and order. The orchestration of these movements required both mental and physical discipline, ensuring that even minor distractions did not disturb the overall impression of calmness and refinement. Through these practices, Victorian women developed a deep awareness of their own behavior and its impact on others. Every action at the table was both self-regulated and socially informed. Manners taught attentiveness, empathy, and anticipation, reinforcing lessons in patience, observation, and social grace. In essence, mealtime became a microcosm of society itself,
structured, hierarchical, and governed by subtle yet powerful codes of conduct. The moral dimension of dining was never overlooked. Women internalized the belief that refinement of behavior mirrored moral character. Polite restraint, patience, and consideration of others were not merely aesthetic virtues, they were moral imperatives. Conduct at the table became a demonstration of virtue, signaling not only elegance but integrity, thoughtfulness, and social responsibility. In this sense, the lessons of dining extended beyond etiquette, shaping the ethical and emotional development of women. Even the silent moments of a meal, the pause between courses, the soft contemplation of a dessert, the gentle acknowledgement of a guest, were imbued with meaning. Silence, like speech and gesture, conveyed attentiveness,
Courtship filled with unspoken boundaries. In Victorian society, courtship was a delicate dance, choreographed with an intricate understanding of restraint, propriety, and the unspoken rules that governed interaction between men and women. Unlike the casual meetings or spontaneous encounters seen in later centuries, romantic engagement in this era was governed by codes so subtle that one misstep could damage reputation or diminish social standing. Every gesture, glance, and word carried meaning, yet much of it was invisible to the untrained eye, requiring careful observation and constant awareness. The boundaries of courtship were established early, often long before any formal introduction to a potential suitor. Families monitored social interactions meticulously, arranging meetings, dances, and social visits to allow observation without impropriety. Young women were trained to interpret gestures, expressions, and the rhythm of conversation, learning which signs of attention were appropriate and which suggested excessive familiarity or overstepping. They were taught to maintain composure at all times, to manage interest with subtlety, and to respond with measured warmth rather than unrestrained emotion. For Eleanor and her peers, even casual interactions required careful negotiation. A nod, a smile, or a greeting could be laden with meaning. Acknowledging someone too often might suggest interest. Too little could be interpreted as aloofness or disdain. Every social encounter was an opportunity to practice restraint, to observe the fine line between propriety and impropriety, and to signal interest or disinterest in a manner socially acceptable. Courtship became a system of codes, a language built on gestures, positioning, and conversation, as much as on formal declarations. Dances were central to this structured engagement. In the spacious halls of estates or town venues, young women learned to move gracefully with partners, balancing attention and decorum. A dance was both an expression of refinement and a test of composure. Maintaining proper posture, responding to the rhythm, and engaging with the partner while observing the subtle cues of propriety required concentration and social intelligence. Each turn, step, and bow carried meaning, revealing discipline, training, and the ability to navigate social nuances with elegance. Visits and calls reinforced these lessons. A young woman might receive a gentleman visitor in the drawing room, carefully following the rules of etiquette while demonstrating interest or reserve through subtle measures. The duration of conversation, the choice of topics, and the modulation of tone were all carefully controlled. Even laughter or gestures of approval had to be moderated. Excessive warmth could suggest eagerness, while too little could appear cold or discourteous. These subtle negotiations taught young women to manage attention, preserve dignity, and maintain influence without overt assertion. Family oversight was constant. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters monitored interactions, guiding behavior through gentle reminders, soft corrections, or quiet observation. Their presence ensured that all gestures remained within acceptable bounds and provided a layer of protection, both socially and morally.
They taught young women to interpret the intentions of suitors, to recognize signs of respect or impropriety, and to respond with tact, poise, and subtlety. Courtship was therefore not merely a private affair, but a social performance, carefully supervised and codified by those who understood the rules. Even the written word played a role. Letters exchanged between young women and potential suitors were tightly controlled, often supervised or passed through intermediaries. Language was formal, emotions carefully moderated, and personal revelations limited. A misplaced phrase, an overly intimate comment, or a sign of impatience could lead to misunderstanding or social disapproval. Letters thus became exercises in self-restraint, teaching women how to convey sentiment while maintaining propriety and demonstrating refinement. Physical boundaries were strictly observed. Touch was rare, fleeting, and regulated. A handshake, a light brush of the hand during a dance, or the occasional bow were permissible, but more intimate contact was prohibited. Women learned to manage their own movements and responses to others' gestures, maintaining a balance between social engagement and moral decorum. Every step, every adjustment of clothing or posture, and even the angle of the head could convey messages about availability, interest, or propriety, making subtlety essential. Conversation required equal skill. Topics were carefully chosen, often focusing on socially approved subjects, such as literature, music, local events, or family matters. Personal opinions were offered sparingly, and strong emotions were never displayed openly. Wit and intelligence could be shown, but always within limits, moderated by the need to appear gentle, refined, and composed. Through these careful interactions, women learned to express themselves within the constraints of propriety, cultivating influence without transgression. Observation was a crucial component of learning courtship. Women watched their peers, noting the success of gestures, phrases, or composure in securing suitors' attention. They observed the reactions of suitors to posture, eye contact, and language, internalizing the unspoken codes that guided interaction. By careful mimicry and adaptation, they gradually learned to navigate the complexities of courtship, balancing interest with restraint, curiosity with caution, and self-expression with propriety. Public appearances were similarly regulated. Strolling in gardens, attending church, or visiting neighbors offered opportunities for courtship, but required vigilance. Women had to maintain composure, manage glances, and interact with suitors in ways that allowed observation without overstepping bounds. Companions, chaperones, or family members were always present to ensure that behavior remained appropriate, providing both oversight and protection, while facilitating subtle interaction. Even attire played a role in courtship. Dresses, gloves, hats, and accessories were chosen to convey refinement, elegance, and modest interest. Bright or ostentatious colors were avoided, while muted tones and delicate fabrics communicated propriety. The careful arrangement of hair, the tilt of the head, and the placement of gloves could signal attention or reserve, allowing women to participate in the social ritual of courtship without violating the strictures of morality. Missteps in courtship could have lasting consequences. A word spoken too freely, an action interpreted incorrectly, or a gesture perceived as improper could tarnish reputation, invite gossip, or restrict future opportunities. Women internalized these risks early, learning vigilance, patience, and subtlety as protective measures. In this context, restraint was not merely a social expectation, it was a survival skill, safeguarding reputation, opportunity, and personal dignity. Courtship also involved the cultivation of patience. Decisions about engagement, affection, and social interaction were never rushed. Women learned to modulate enthusiasm, temper curiosity, and navigate the slow progression of interest, observation, and mutual acknowledgement.
Each step was deliberate, providing time to assess character, behavior, and social compatibility, ensuring that emotional and social engagement developed within acceptable bounds. Emotion, while present, was tightly controlled. Joy, attraction, or curiosity were experienced privately, expressed subtly, and never allowed to disrupt composure. In this way, courtship became both a social and emotional education, teaching discretion, empathy, and the management of personal sentiment. The unspoken nature of many boundaries made communication a sophisticated art. A glance could signify approval or interest. A pause in conversation might signal hesitation or contemplation. Women learned to read nuance, interpret subtle cues, and respond in kind, mastering a language of gestures, posture, and tone that required intelligence, attention, and awareness. Courtship in this sense became a study of human behavior, teaching both observation and self-regulation. Even minor decisions carried significance. Choosing where to walk, how long to visit, or which seating arrangement to accept required awareness of both propriety and perception. Each action was interpreted in the context of social norms, and women learned to navigate these choices with careful judgment. Courtship was therefore an education in strategy, subtlety, and ethical conduct, preparing women for the complex interplay of relationships, social expectations, and personal desire. In the end, Victorian courtship was less about romance and more about social mastery. Women learned to balance interest and reserve, observation and action, emotion and control. They were trained to manage their behavior,
The daily practice of being ladylike. In Victorian society, the concept of being ladylike was more than a social expectation. It was a daily discipline, a lifelong regimen that shaped every gesture, movement, and thought of a woman. From the moment a young girl awoke to the quiet hours before sleep, she was taught to perform grace, restraint, and refinement with meticulous attention. Being a lady was not merely about appearance or propriety. It was a state of constant awareness, a continuous exercise in control, observation, and subtle influence. The day began with ritual. Upon waking, a young woman would rise carefully, taking care to stretch or adjust her posture in a manner that preserved elegance and fluidity of movement. Dressing was a deliberate process, not simply a matter of clothing oneself, but of preparing a living embodiment of propriety. Corsets were fastened with attention to symmetry and posture, skirts arranged to fall in perfect folds, and petticoats fluffed to avoid uneven silhouettes. Even the choice of undergarments mattered, affecting both the shape and the ease of motion throughout the day. Hair was arranged with precision, often bound, braided, or pinned to maintain an orderly appearance. Every strand that threatened to escape attention could suggest carelessness, impatience, or lack of refinement. Similarly, jewelry was selected to complement attire without calling undue attention, and gloves were adjusted to cover hands elegantly while allowing for subtle gestural communication. In these early moments, a woman's daily life became a rehearsal, an exercise in discipline and self-presentation that continued in every interaction that followed. Movement itself became a language of refinement. Walking required attention to posture, foot placement, and rhythm. Shoulders were held back, arms close to the body, and steps measured to convey grace without haste. Sitting demanded similar awareness, a poised alignment of the back, careful placement of hands on lap or chair, and an avoidance of slouching or fidgeting. In every gesture, the appearance of effortlessness masked hours of training, observation, and adjustment, reinforcing the image of a calm, controlled, and composed lady.
Speech, too, was governed by rules, both overt and subtle. Words were chosen for clarity, tone, and appropriateness, avoiding both excess and brusqueness. Laughter was moderated, conversational contributions measured, and interruptions carefully avoided. The cadence of speech reflected composure, intelligence, and social awareness, signaling refinement and discretion. Even silence was meaningful. Pauses indicated thoughtfulness, respect, or measured judgment, demonstrating control over both emotion and expression. Household duties provided further practice. Tasks such as arranging flowers, managing meals, or attending to guests required women to perform actions with a soft, deliberate grace. Every adjustment of a tablecloth, every pouring of tea, and every placement of utensils was executed to reflect composure and attention to detail. Through repetition, these small gestures became habitual, shaping both the physical presence and the social acumen of a young lady. Reading and writing also formed part of daily practice. Books, letters, and notes offered opportunities to refine thought, expression, and hand movements. Reading aloud provided lessons in vocal control and phrasing, while writing with careful script reinforced both patience and composure. The process of thought, translation into words, and physical execution through penmanship was itself an exercise in discipline, teaching women to coordinate intellect, emotion, and gesture with subtle precision. Even leisure required vigilance. Music, drawing, embroidery, and social visits were undertaken with the same attention to propriety, posture, and comportment. In music, hand positioning, breath control, and emotional restraint were observed. In embroidery, patience, precision, and consistency were emphasized. Each activity was more than a pastime. It was training in observation, refinement, and quiet self-control. In these repetitive practices, women internalized the behaviors that defined ladylike composure, integrating them seamlessly into daily life. Interactions with family members demanded equal attention. Speaking to parents, siblings, or elders required measured tone, careful phrasing, and respectful posture. Even minor disagreements were navigated with discretion, avoiding displays of anger or frustration. Emotional regulation was constant. Excitement, irritation, or sadness was either concealed or expressed in subtle, socially approved forms. Daily life thus became a continuous rehearsal in the performance of calmness, self-discipline, and social intelligence. Social visits and obligations heightened these expectations. Women observed rules of entrance, greeting, seating, and conversation with exacting care. Movement through rooms, handling of objects, and even direction of gaze were measured to demonstrate poise. The ability to navigate these spaces with composure reflected both training and character, signaling refinement and competence to all observers. Each interaction, however brief, reinforced the performance of being a lady. Attention to detail extended to physical appearance throughout the day. Clothing was adjusted discreetly to maintain smooth lines, gloves, hats, and accessories repositioned as needed, and posture continuously monitored to avoid signs of fatigue or imbalance. Even minor corrections were executed with subtlety, ensuring that the appearance of effortlessness was maintained at all times. This constant awareness reinforced the internalization of discipline, creating habits that governed every movement and action. Mealtime manners, previously learned, were integrated seamlessly into daily practice. Utensil use, pacing, conversation,
and observation during meals required continuous attention, ensuring that refinement was maintained across both formal and informal settings. The ability to execute these behaviors automatically reflected the internalization of social codes and the successful cultivation of ladylike comportment. Public appearances provided additional challenges. Strolling through gardens, attending church, or walking in town required the same level of awareness as private activities. Posture, movement, dress, and interaction were scrutinized both by peers and by the wider community. Women learned to anticipate observation, adjust behavior proactively, and perform grace in all circumstances, reinforcing the continuity of their daily training. Even in private moments, vigilance persisted. Letters, personal reflection, and solitary study were opportunities to refine self-control, intellectual cultivation, and composure. The daily practice of being ladylike extended beyond the social sphere, shaping internal habits, emotional regulation, and thought processes. Women learned to align their internal selves with the expectations of external behavior, creating a seamless integration of refinement, discipline, and composure. The practice of being ladylike also involved managing emotional expression in nuanced ways. Joy, curiosity, or excitement were moderated to avoid impropriety. Disappointment or irritation was concealed or expressed subtly, and empathy, concern, or admiration was communicated with discretion. Through continuous practice, women developed emotional intelligence that allowed them to navigate complex social environments with subtlety and poise. Mentorship and observation reinforced daily practice. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters provided instruction, gentle correction, and demonstration of expected behaviors. Young women learned to watch, imitate, and refine their own actions in response. Over time, repeated observation and practice shaped automatic behaviors, ensuring that grace, composure, and propriety became second nature. Even routine tasks like walking from one room to another, adjusting clothing, or interacting with household staff were performed with the same attention to detail. The rhythm of movement, modulation of speech, and awareness of posture were continuous.
Dressing for the public eye, not comfort. In Victorian society, clothing was never merely functional. It was a statement, a social language, and a reflection of character, status, and morality. Women were acutely aware that every dress, accessory, and layer contributed to the perception of refinement, virtue, and social worth. The art of dressing for the public eye, rather than for personal comfort, became a daily ritual, a performance that required time, skill, and considerable endurance. For many women, comfort was secondary to propriety, and elegance demanded both patience and sacrifice. From the moment a young woman awoke, attention turned to clothing as a tool for both presentation and social negotiation. Corsets were laced with exacting precision, compressing the torso into the idealized silhouette of the age. Skirts were layered and fluffed, petticoats arranged to create graceful folds, and hems adjusted to skim the floor without tripping. Even undergarments were selected with care to shape the figure correctly, influencing posture, movement, and appearance. Every garment was chosen not for ease or practicality, but for the impression it would create when the woman stepped into public view. Hairstyles, equally elaborate, were extensions of this social performance. Hair was bound, coiled, or pinned with meticulous attention to detail, often reinforced with combs, pins, and delicate hairpieces. Stray hairs were smoothed, and curls arranged to frame the face in the exact manner considered appropriate. Jewelry was carefully chosen to complement the outfit, signaling wealth and refinement without appearing ostentatious. Hats, gloves, and parasols were not merely accessories, but essential tools for maintaining decorum, subtly communicating social status, taste, and self-awareness. The process of dressing itself required skill, patience, and sometimes assistance. Buttons, hooks, and laces were fastened slowly and deliberately, ensuring symmetry and precision. A corset, tightly bound, restricted movement, yet demanded careful attention to posture, teaching the wearer to stand, sit, and walk with poise. Skirts and petticoats constrained motion, creating an environment where every step, turn, and gesture was measured and intentional. Comfort was secondary, elegance and public perception were paramount. Footwear further exemplified this tension between appearance and ease. Shoes were often stiff, structured, and designed to shape the foot into a socially acceptable form. Walking in them required careful practice, as missteps could result in tripping or a disruption of the desired silhouette. Even the act of ascending stairs or navigating uneven surfaces became an exercise in composure, a constant reminder that clothing was a tool for social expression rather than practical comfort. Once dressed, women learned to inhabit their attire with fluidity, transforming the restrictions of fabric and structure into a graceful performance. Movement was guided by the constraints of corsets, the weight of layered skirts, and the length of train or hem. Arms were carried close to the body to maintain the smooth lines of the silhouette. Steps were small and deliberate to preserve balance. In these adjustments, women mastered the subtle art of negotiating clothing's limitations while projecting ease, elegance, and poise. Social occasions heightened these challenges. Attending church, visiting neighbors, or walking through town required a careful balance between display and discretion. Clothing communicated wealth, taste, and propriety, and a woman's ability to move gracefully within restrictive attire was observed and judged. A gown that betrayed effort, shoes that clicked too loudly, or a misaligned accessory could undermine the carefully cultivated impression of refinement. Dress became both shield and statement, defining the woman to the world before a word was spoken. The public eye was omnipresent. Family, acquaintances, and strangers alike assessed every detail of appearance, from the alignment of a bodice to the tilt of a hat. Women internalized these judgments, performing constantly for observers, while maintaining composure. Reflection in mirrors provided rehearsal, allowing self-correction and adjustment before public exposure. Clothing, therefore, was not only external, but psychological, a reminder of social expectations, personal discipline, and the continuous performance of refinement. Even private moments were influenced by public standards. Anticipation of visitors, calls, or promenades prompted careful selection and preparation of attire. Women rehearsed gestures, practiced walks, and seated postures to ensure that every movement appeared effortless in full view.
Dressing for the public eye, not comfort. In Victorian society, clothing was never merely functional. It was a statement, a social language, and a reflection of character, status, and morality. Women were acutely aware that every dress, accessory, and layer contributed to the perception of refinement, virtue, and social worth. The art of dressing for the public eye, rather than for personal comfort, became a daily ritual, a performance that required time, skill, and considerable endurance. For many women, comfort was secondary to propriety, and elegance demanded both patience and sacrifice. From the moment a young woman awoke, attention turned to clothing as a tool for both presentation and social negotiation. Corsets were laced with exacting precision, compressing the torso into the idealized silhouette of the age. Skirts were layered and fluffed, petticoats arranged to create graceful folds, and hems adjusted to skim the floor without tripping. Even undergarments were selected with care to shape the figure correctly, influencing posture, movement, and appearance. Every garment was chosen not for ease or practicality, but for the impression it would create when the woman stepped into public view. Hairstyles, equally elaborate, were extensions of this social performance. Hair was bound, coiled, or pinned with meticulous attention to detail, often reinforced with combs, pins, and delicate hairpieces. Stray hairs were smoothed and curls arranged to frame the face in the exact manner considered appropriate. Jewelry was carefully chosen to complement the outfit, signaling wealth and refinement without appearing ostentatious. Hats, gloves, and parasols were not merely accessories, but essential tools for maintaining decorum, subtly communicating social status, taste, and self-awareness. The process of dressing itself required skill, patience, and sometimes assistance. Buttons, hooks, and laces were fastened slowly and deliberately, ensuring symmetry and precision. A corset, tightly bound, restricted movement, yet demanded careful attention to posture, teaching the wearer to stand, sit, and walk with poise. Skirts and petticoats constrained motion, creating an environment where every step, turn, and gesture was measured and intentional. Comfort was secondary, elegance and public perception were paramount. Footwear further exemplified this tension between appearance and ease. Shoes were often stiff, structured, and designed to shape the foot into a socially acceptable form. Walking in them required careful practice, as missteps could result in tripping or a disruption of the desired silhouette. Even the act of ascending stairs or navigating uneven surfaces became an exercise in composure, a constant reminder that clothing was a tool for social expression rather than practical comfort. Once dressed, women learned to inhabit their attire with fluidity, transforming the restrictions of fabric and structure into a graceful performance. Movement was guided by the constraints of corsets, the weight of layered skirts, and the length of train or hem. Arms were carried close to the body to maintain the smooth lines of the silhouette. Steps were small and deliberate to preserve balance. In these adjustments, women mastered the subtle art of negotiating clothing's limitations while projecting ease, elegance, and poise. Social occasions heightened these challenges. Attending church, visiting neighbors, or walking through town required a careful balance between display and discretion. Clothing communicated wealth, taste, and propriety, and a woman's ability to move gracefully within restrictive attire was observed and judged. A gown that betrayed effort, shoes that clicked too loudly, or a misaligned accessory could undermine the carefully cultivated impression of refinement. Dress became both shield and statement, defining the woman to the world before a word was spoken. The public eye was omnipresent. Family, acquaintances, and strangers alike assessed every detail of appearance, from the alignment of a bodice to the tilt of a hat. Women internalized these judgments, performing constantly for observers while maintaining composure. Reflection in mirrors provided rehearsal, allowing self-correction and adjustment before public exposure. Clothing.
The rule of not wanting too much. In Victorian society, desire was a matter of careful discipline, particularly for women. The rule of not wanting too much, whether wealth, attention, luxury, or personal freedom, was silently but powerfully enforced. Young women were taught that moderation in aspiration was a moral virtue, a reflection of refinement, and a prerequisite for respectability. To want excessively, openly or visibly, was to risk social censure, suspicion, or subtle disapproval. The lesson was clear. Restraint and desire was both an expectation and a form of character training.
instilling humility, patience, and awareness of social hierarchy. This principle permeated daily life, influencing thoughts, speech, and behavior. Eleanor, like many women of her time, learned early that ambition or longing must be tempered. She observed older sisters, mothers, and aunts as they balanced personal curiosity with societal expectation, often concealing private desires behind measured smiles, composed postures, and understated gestures. Every movement, every choice, every glance was subtly informed by the need to appear contented, composed, and modest in aspiration. The home itself reflected these lessons. Furnishings were modestly arranged, opulence minimized, and attention focused on refinement rather than extravagance. Even in households of relative wealth, women were taught to avoid flaunting possessions or emphasizing luxury. Clothing, jewelry, and personal adornments were selected with careful restraint, signaling taste without drawing undue attention. Desire, like all things visible, had to be controlled. Moderation was a visible marker of propriety. Even happiness required permission. In the Victorian era, happiness was not an unrestrained, private affair, but a carefully monitored and socially mediated state. For women particularly, joy and pleasure were rarely spontaneous. They required observation, timing, and often subtle approval from family, social superiors, or the broader community. Society dictated not only what was permissible to desire, but also how that desire could be expressed. In this way, even the experience of happiness became a lesson in restraint, propriety, and patience, a delicate balancing act between private feeling and public expectation. Eleanor, like many women of her time, learned early that exuberance had its limits. Laughter, cheerfulness, and personal delight were to be exercised in moderation, always tempered with composure and careful observation of context. A smile could express gratitude or pleasure, but too broad a grin suggested frivolity or impropriety. A laugh, even at a subtle joke, had to be measured, soft, and fleeting, leaving no hint of excess. Joy, when openly displayed, was subject to evaluation by family members, peers, and society at large. This regulation extended to moments of leisure. Walks in the garden, embroidery by the window, or reading aloud in the drawing room were allowed, yet even in these private activities, enjoyment had to conform to decorum. Sitting too close to a suitor during a walk could be interpreted as impropriety. Lingering laughter over a story read aloud could be noted as a sign of lack of composure. The very experience of pleasure required awareness of setting, timing, and potential judgment. Happiness was therefore conditional, permitted only when expressed in socially approved ways. Social gatherings were especially structured around this delicate negotiation. Balls, teas, and afternoon visits required women to participate in activities that could bring delight, but always under careful supervision. Pleasure in music, dancing, or conversation was permissible, but only within defined limits. Guests observed posture, tone of voice, and subtle expressions of enjoyment, ensuring that the enjoyment did not spill over into excess. Even approval from a gentleman caller had to be received with moderation. To accept too readily might suggest forwardness or desire beyond what was considered appropriate. Family influence was omnipresent. Mothers, aunts, and older sisters acted as both guides and regulators, teaching young women how to experience and express joy discreetly. A moment of laughter might be accompanied by a gentle reminder to sit properly, adjust posture, or temper expression. A small triumph, such as finishing a piece of embroidery or receiving praise for a musical performance, was to be acknowledged with modesty rather than unrestrained delight. Through these interventions, young women internalized the principle that happiness, while permitted, was never entirely free. It had to be earned, observed, and controlled.
Even private desires required subtle negotiation. A longing for a particular book, a wish for a new dress, or a fleeting curiosity about life beyond the household had to be moderated. Expressing these desires openly could risk social disapproval or familial censure. Women learned to redirect these feelings into socially approved channels, finding small, permissible ways to indulge curiosity and pleasure without transgressing boundaries. This cultivation of restraint taught patience, perception, and the careful management of both emotion and action. Education and intellectual engagement provided opportunities for happiness within socially sanctioned limits. Reading, drawing, music, and writing were permitted outlets for self-expression and enjoyment. Yet even in these pursuits, overt excitement or ambition had to be tempered. A well-placed compliment or gentle encouragement could bring pleasure, but the individual had to maintain composure. Exuberance, pride, or impatience in achievement was considered a flaw in character, demonstrating a lack of refinement or discipline. Courtship added another layer of complexity. Romantic interest and attraction could inspire joy, yet even these feelings had to be contained within strict social boundaries. Smiles, glances, and subtle gestures communicated appreciation and pleasure, but unrestrained emotion was deemed improper. Eleanor learned that moments of happiness in courtship were carefully measured, often mediated by parental oversight or societal expectation. Emotional expression had to harmonize with decorum, requiring constant awareness and careful judgment. Even the simple pleasures of friendship were regulated. Conversations with peers, shared laughter, and exchanged confidences were permitted, but excessive enthusiasm or familiarity was discouraged. Friendship, like other forms of interaction, required observation, restraint, and subtlety. Emotional expression was to be shared in controlled amounts, reinforcing the expectation that joy must be expressed with discretion and social awareness. Clothing and appearance, always central to Victorian life, also influenced the experience of happiness. Wearing a new dress, arranging hair perfectly, or receiving a compliment on appearance could bring private satisfaction, yet outward expression of delight had to be tempered. Posture, tone of voice, and gesture were continuously monitored, ensuring that even simple joys and personal adornment were aligned with societal expectation. Pleasure was permissible, but always in moderation and always observed. Leisure activities outside the home were similarly regulated. Walks in the garden, carriage rides through town, or visits to social events provided opportunities for enjoyment, yet every action was subject to scrutiny. Women learned to moderate laughter, to contain gestures of excitement, and to perform composure while participating in activities that might naturally inspire delight. Happiness became a carefully rehearsed experience, orchestrated to satisfy both personal feeling and public expectation. Religious and moral instruction reinforced these lessons. Joy, when expressed excessively, was sometimes framed as vanity or lack of discipline, while measured pleasure was celebrated as refinement, virtue, and moral propriety. Women internalized these teachings, developing an awareness of the delicate boundary between appropriate happiness and socially condemned exuberance. Through continuous practice, patience, and observation, they learned to navigate personal feelings while maintaining outward decorum. Even in moments of personal reflection, happiness required internal moderation. Journaling, solitary study, or quiet contemplation offered opportunities for emotional engagement, but women were taught to temper enthusiasm, anticipate social expectation, and cultivate self-restraint. Pleasure was experienced internally, often hidden from public view, reinforcing the understanding that happiness was both a personal experience and a social performance. The cultivation of patience was essential. Anticipation, delayed gratification, and the measured pursuit of permissible pleasures shaped character and emotional resilience. Women learned to defer immediate satisfaction in favor of socially acceptable outcomes, teaching both discipline and foresight. This practice, repeated across various aspects of life, reinforced the notion that happiness was a privilege, carefully granted and carefully expressed. Even household duties could influence the experience of joy. Tasks such as arranging flowers, managing meals, or attending to domestic routines offered satisfaction, but only when performed with precision, composure, and decorum. Errors or visible frustration diminished the pleasure and invited criticism. Conversely, executing tasks gracefully, managing small successes with quiet pride, and finding subtle delight in routine actions allowed women to experience happiness within the strictures of expectation. Observation of others became a tool for learning how to experience joy appropriately. Women watched peers, relatives, and neighbors to gauge reactions, measure expression, and internalize norms. A glance, a smile, or a whispered comment could reveal the limits of permissible pleasure, teaching subtlety, timing, and discretion. In this way, even social learning was entwined with the careful management of emotion and social awareness. The act of giving and receiving also shaped experiences of happiness. Gifts, compliments, or attention from others were acknowledged with composure, gratitude, and discretion. Excessive delight, eagerness, or visible excitement was discouraged. Women internalized the principle that pleasure derived from others' generosity or approval had to be balanced with humility and restraint, ensuring that social harmony and propriety were maintained. Through continuous practice, women learned to navigate life with measured emotional expression. Happiness was never taken for granted, never allowed to overflow beyond socially approved boundaries. Every smile, laugh, and expression of delight was filtered through an awareness.
Looking back at rules that silenced a generation. As the sun dipped low behind the spires and rooftops of Victorian towns, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets and quiet gardens, women like Eleanor often found themselves reflecting on a life shaped by invisible forces, subtle expectations, and persistent social rules. These were not overt laws written in ink or enforced by harsh authority, but subtler codes that dictated behavior, molded character, and quietly restrained both thought and desire. The rules that governed speech, movement, dress, and even emotion created a world where composure was prized above self-expression, and discipline was valued over personal freedom. Looking back, it became clear that an entire generation of women had been, in many ways, silenced, not through explicit coercion, but through a web of expectations so pervasive that conformity became second nature. Eleanor's memory traced the contours of her life with a mixture of understanding, melancholy, and acceptance. From her earliest days, she had been instructed in the art of silence. Speaking too freely, laughing too loudly, or expressing strong opinion was discouraged. A soft tone and carefully measured words were the markers of refinement. In family parlors, she learned to observe before speaking, to consider the impact of her voice on others, and to master the delicate balance between contribution and discretion. Over time, this guidance evolved into habit. Silence became natural, a tool of survival as much as propriety. The first lesson of her upbringing, that restraint was a virtue, permeated her identity. The lessons of posture, movement, and gesture were equally ingrained, from morning routines that included the careful lacing of corsets, arrangement of skirts, and adjustment of gloves, to the deliberate choreography of walking across the room. Her body was trained to conform to the ideal of grace and composure. Each small adjustment of shoulders, placement of hands, or tilt of the head was both practice and performance. These physical disciplines, though ostensibly about elegance, were also subtle mechanisms of control, teaching women to inhabit a constrained form in both body and social space. Reflection on these memories revealed how much of her existence had been governed by outward appearances, sometimes at the expense of comfort, spontaneity, or self-expression.
Clothing, so central to the performance of Victorian femininity, became a daily exercise in negotiation with society. Corsets compressed the body, skirts restricted movement, and layers upon layers dictated posture and gait. Even in private, dressing required awareness of potential observation and anticipation of social interaction. Each article of clothing was imbued with symbolism, status, refinement, moral virtue, and adherence to societal norms. Comfort was sacrificed, desires subdued, and individuality subsumed within the broader code of propriety. Eleanor recalled the long mornings spent adjusting hemlines and smoothing bodices, conscious of how each detail would be scrutinized by the public eye. These habits reinforce discipline, but they also reinforce the subtle silencing of personal ease and preference. Perhaps the most insidious of the constraints was the regulation of emotion. Smiles had to be gentle, laughter controlled, and joy moderated. Even personal ambitions, academic, artistic, or social, were tempered by expectation. To desire too strongly, to express too freely, was to risk censure, social disapproval, or subtle isolation. The lesson was internalized. Happiness, curiosity, and pride were all subject to careful negotiation with authority, family, and society. In reflecting on her life, Eleanor recognized how often her true feelings had been masked, hidden behind measured gestures and carefully constructed expressions. The cost of propriety was often silence of the inner self. Courtship and social engagement further illustrated the pervasive influence of societal rules. Romantic interest, attention, and personal preference were carefully moderated, observed, and performed with discretion. Eleanor remembered walks through manicured gardens, conversations at afternoon teas, and fleeting glances exchanged across parlors, all meticulously orchestrated within unspoken codes of conduct. Each interaction was a lesson in restraint. Admiration had to be subtle, curiosity tempered, and personal enthusiasm muted. Even the most innocent pleasures required vigilance, ensuring that every expression aligned with expectation. Looking back, Eleanor saw how the choreography of romance had taught restraint as much as civility. Education and intellectual ambition were similarly circumscribed. Learning was encouraged, but only within boundaries deemed appropriate. Excessive ambition, outspoken opinion, or visible intellectual pride was discouraged. Women were permitted knowledge, but not prominence. Eleanor's studies in literature, music, and philosophy were pursued quietly, accomplishments enjoyed internally, but rarely displayed with confidence. Desire for recognition was to be tempered by modesty, aspiration balanced by expectation, and curiosity expressed within socially sanctioned limits. Over time, intellectual growth was both fostered and constrained, a subtle balancing act that reinforced both refinement and restraint. Even leisure and pleasure were mediated by social rules. Walks in the countryside, embroidery, reading by candlelight, or listening to music were all permissible, but enjoyment had to be measured, observed, and moderated. Excessive delight, spontaneity, or exuberance could be interpreted as impropriety or immaturity. Eleanor remembered how moments of private amusement were often accompanied by self-consciousness, awareness of how her reactions might be judged if witnessed. Joy itself, though present, was framed by invisible limits, teaching patience, discretion, and self-control as much as contentment. Family oversight, social observation, and the omnipresent awareness of propriety created a continuous system of reinforcement. Every gesture, glance, or word was filtered through learned habits and expectation. Eleanor reflected on how these subtle pressures accumulated over decades, shaping not only behavior but inner thought, perception, and identity. The lessons of restraint became automatic, creating a lifetime of measured expression, silent endurance, and controlled desire. The rules did not shout, they whispered, infiltrating daily life so seamlessly that obedience felt natural. Yet, within this pervasive structure, there were small victories of self-expression, however constrained.
moments of shared laughter with close friends, satisfaction from completing delicate embroidery, or quiet intellectual engagement with literature offered glimpses of inner life. These moments were carefully curated, private and fleeting, but they were treasured. Eleanor realized that even in a world of subtle restrictions, women found ways to cultivate joy, creativity, and personal agency, often in ways imperceptible to society at large. The silencing was not total, it was nuanced, pervasive, and enduring, but not absolute. In reflecting upon these rules, Eleanor could see the paradox of Victorian femininity. Women were trained to appear composed, modest, and disciplined, yet this very discipline created a form of resilience, patience, and social intelligence. The silencing of unrestrained desire, expression, and emotion fostered acute observation, careful judgment, and a subtle mastery of social navigation. The lessons were restrictive, certainly, but they also imparted skills, endurance, and awareness that could not be easily taught through overt instruction. Time itself transformed perspective. Eleanor observed the younger generation of women, daughters, nieces, and students, learning many of the same rules, yet questioning, negotiating, and occasionally bending them. The cultural currents that had strictly defined her own life were shifting slowly as women began to assert small liberties, test boundaries, and explore modes of self-expression previously considered improper. In looking back, Eleanor recognized both the cost and the legacy of her generation, a life shaped by silence, yet marked by endurance, skill, and subtle sophistication. The rules that had silenced a generation were not merely external impositions, they were internalized, woven into thought, habit, and perception. Eleanor understood that her own life had been guided by these imperceptible forces, shaping not only behavior but imagination, aspiration, and desire. The memory of these constraints, while tinged with melancholy, also revealed the quiet strength cultivated through compliance, observation, and self-discipline. Women like her had learned to navigate a complex social landscape with grace, intelligence, and subtlety, even when freedom of speech, motion, and expression was restricted. The Victorian world demanded a delicate performance, grace, propriety, and self-restraint at every moment, with even happiness requiring careful negotiation. Yet in that performance, women discovered resourcefulness, subtle agency, and quiet accomplishment. Eleanor's reflection revealed both the costs and the hidden victories. A generation constrained, yes, but also disciplined, perceptive, and enduring. The lessons were etched not only in posture and dress, but in thought, expression, and moral awareness, forming a legacy that was at once confining and instructive. Looking back, Eleanor realized that history is shaped as much by silence as by speech.